brilliant scientist and devoted family man.
Eugene was a beautiful person.
He definitely wanted to change the world for the better.
Found viciously beaten to death.
32 lacerations to the face and body.
He had suffered a crushed trachea.
Police uncover a trail of evidence and search for a brutal killer.
The volume of blood told the story of how far the struggle went.
There were numerous items of evidence seized.
Several suspects emerge.
We did receive tips that it was a professional hit.
He was doing work that might have threatened someone enough that it murdered him.
I knew him to be someone who would maybe not want to cross.
Until the case takes a jaw-dropping turn.
And then a bombshell was dropped.
We thought that we were really onto something, and that kind of fell apart.
And the truth is revealed.
You're telling a family that you've arrested the right people.
We were back to square one.
She wasn't telling us all this stuff out of the goodness of her heart.
It just didn't sound like it could be possible.
Norwich is a small city in eastern Connecticut, known as the Rose of New England.
The city of Norwich is an old mill town. It's not as affluent as the rest of Connecticut. There's poverty here, there's hard luck here. But overall, it's a good city. It's one of those places that doesn't change much.
But on the night of May 14th, 2004, Norwich was shaken to its core by a horrible crime.
911. I was coming here to look at an apartment and there's someone laying on the ground. He's not moving and he looks like he's dead.
Police and paramedics race to the scene.
They found a white male in his 50s. There was a lot of blood. It was a horrific scene. And the paramedic indicated that the unresponsive person was deceased. Upon arrival at the scene, we could tell that there was a vicious beating with numerous strikes to the face with some unknown object.
He had suffered quite a lot of injuries to his face and neck. And there was a pattern on his clothing. It looked like it may have been shoe impressions.
There may have been a case of someone either stepping or stomping upon the victim.
The victim's shoes were missing, a wallet, and some other items were missing that he would have normally had.
The missing items suggest a robbery, but what explains the viciousness of the attack?
The volume of blood told the story of how far the struggle went from the side of the house to a car parked in the driveway. The violent struggle had moved throughout the backyard to the location where the body was found. There's always a possibility that it was a random crime, but the manner of death did raise our suspicions about it being possibly more of a personal nature.
The forensic team gets to work.
They collected the blood, hair, fiber, evidence, anything that they could find at the scene.
But this crime scene poses unique challenges for investigators.
The property itself appeared to have been in the process of being cleaned up.
There was a lot of debris. There was broken glass, and there was metal, there was, bike parts.
It was difficult to see if any of that material had anything to do with the crime scene. We did not determine the murder weapon at the scene.
There were numerous items of evidence seized.
We saw a hose in the backyard that had blood on it. A keychain was found at the scene, and a brick with some apparent blood residue. The situation with the house told us that the victim was not residing in the house.
Detectives turned to the 911 caller for a statement.
She said she had seen a for rent sign, and she called the number.
The woman who answered said that her husband, the owner, was at the house.
She says, "Oh yeah, my husband's down there working on the property. We should go talk to him."
So she went to the property and discovered the body in the driveway. She dialed 911 at approximately 10:55 p.m.
Police now believe the victim is the owner of the rental property, New Hampshire resident Eugene Maloff.
I conveyed that information to the New Hampshire police, and they were able to notify Joanne Maloff that we had discovered someone that appeared to be her husband.
I received a call at 2 o'clock in the morning from Joanne. And she said, Eugene's been murdered. And it just didn't sound like it could be possible, like it was a bad dream. It just rocked my world.
"56-year-old Eugene Maloff was born and raised in Norwich.
Eugene and I were very close, all through grade school, high school. We just loved each other's company. He was just a down-to-earth, sensitive, nice guy.
Okay, come on. Let's do our standard dance.
Eugene and his wife Joanne were married young and soon after started a family.
Joanne was made for Eugene. They were both very outgoing and had a lot of warmth. Eugene was always very loving to the kids, just very gregarious and sweet. We knew from a very, very young age that he was a genius.
He got his education from Harvard and then MIT, and he had a doctorate in environmental engineering.
He wrote books about outer space and nuclear energy. There aren't many people like him who can both understand the science and communicate the science.
After completing his PhD, Eugene embraced cold fusion, a controversial theory about limitless energy.
Gene got deeply involved in cold fusion, which was contrary to a lot of conventional thought at the time. If cold fusion realizes its potential, you would have unlimited alternative energy. Gene definitely wanted to change the world for the better.
Gene was trying to follow his dream and go on the path less chosen, and he was working on new ways that we could stop global warming and have a better world.
All right, there we are. Well, that's our little house.
Eugene always told his parents that he wanted them to keep the house in Norwich. He was sentimental and he just loved those old memories.
Now, the house that held Eugene's fondest memories had become the scene of his family's worst nightmare.
That was the house that he grew up in, and although he moved to New Hampshire, he had kept the family property and had rented it out for years.
Detectives call Eugene's wife, Joanne, and question her about her husband's last known movements.
She said on this particular day, he had come down to clean up the property, making sure that it was all suitable for renters. And he had a dumpster delivered. Joanne Maloff had spoken to her husband earlier that afternoon, and in fact, she had expected he would be home in New Hampshire by 9 o'clock or so that evening.
Police learned that Eugene had driven his minivan to Norwich that day.
She described the van, and it had some unique markings on it, and also had New Hampshire plates. Mrs. Maloff said the van should have been on the property.
But there was no van in the driveway.
The first thing you're thinking of is that the killer had taken off with Mr. Maloff's van.
He's a family man murdered and brutally beaten. I think that shocks the conscience of any neighborhood.
We felt that whoever was driving that van was complicit with the homicide of Dr. Maloff.
Coming up, investigators uncover conflicting evidence.
They had been involved in a theft of a motor vehicle and some kind of violent struggle.
Blood was sent to the laboratory, but there was no match. It wasn't logical.
And disturbing secrets.
I realized that there were people out there that weren't happy with Jean.
Whose blood is that and where did it come from?
He wanted to commit suicide and was shaking and hyperventilating.
Some of the things regarding her whereabouts on the night of the murder hadn't added up.
I had to accept it, but it was a terrible thing.
Nuclear scientist Eugene Maloff has been found violently beaten to death at the rental property he owns. And police suspect the killer fled in his van.
We put out a bolo, be on the lookout, to all the local police departments for the van.
While detectives wait for news on the van, they interview neighbors.
The purpose of the neighborhood canvas to try and figure out when was the last time Mr. Maloff was seen alive.
We spoke to a neighborhood friend of Dr. Maloff. He indicated that he had seen him mowing the lawn earlier that day, and nothing was suspicious at the time. He did indicate that at about 8:30 p.m. that evening, the van was not there, which gave us a time frame to start working with.
Dr. Maloff had been mowing the lawn. Everything had grass cuttings covering it, from abandoned bicycles and debris on the ground, but there wasn't a stitch of grass on these keys. So we believe that those keys were dropped after Dr. Maloff had mowed the lawn, which would have been sometime around the time of the homicide.
Detectives hope neighbors can help them identify the owner of the keys. But then, police receive an urgent call from a local casino.
We were notified that Dr. Maloff's van had been located in the employee parking lot of the Foxwoods Casino, which was approximately 7 miles away from the crime scene. When we arrived, the tailpipe was cold as if it had been there for several hours. The van was towed back to the City of Norwich Public Works Garage so that the State Police Major Crime Unit could process the van.
They searched the van for hairs, fibers, and anything that looked like blood.
They didn't obtain any fingerprints from the door handles or steering wheel, which indicated to us that the driver quite possibly was wearing gloves.
Investigators hope security footage will help them identify the driver of Eugene's van.
It was a hazy, foggy evening, and we weren't able to gather much evidence at all from the cameras at the Foxwoods Casino.
With the killer still at large, police turn their attention to Eugene's wife, Joanne, in New Hampshire.
Probably a 3-hour drive from New Hampshire to the crime scene. The Maloff family, they had alibis, and they were not suspects at this time. Joanne Maloff couldn't provide anybody's name that would have any intention of hurting her husband.
Police asked Joanne for information about recent tenants at Eugene's rental property in Norwich.
We needed to obtain the identity of all individuals that had lived in the house. They were definitely persons of interest. Joanne Maloff told us that Jean had evicted Pat and Roy Anderson approximately 2 weeks prior to the murder.
Eugene's tenants stopped paying the rent, and Eugene eventually had to look into how to get them out, because I think they were there for a good 6 months before they actually left. Gene didn't want to be cruel to people, and I think he really gave them a lot of leeway, but enough is enough.
For detectives, it's the first break in the investigation.
Pat and Roy Anderson had been living at Mr. Maloff's property for a long period of time, up till the eviction.
My immediate questions were, where are the people that were evicted? How do we locate the Andersons?
Luckily, a tip from a neighbor leads police to the Andersons' son, Chad Schaefer, who lives nearby with his girlfriend, Candace Foster.
One of the investigators went to their apartment to get information about Chad's mom and dad, Patton and Roy.
Purpose of his interview was to determine whether or not the Andersons had seen Gene Meloff on the property, if they'd seen him, when they had last seen him.
Chad claims that his parents had not seen Eugene since he served them the eviction notice.
Chad Schaefer said there were no hard feelings between the Andersons and Gene Meloff.
Police asked Chad for his whereabouts on the night of the murder.
Chad and Candace indicated that they were both home with their newborn on the night in question, and that was their alibi.
Chad cooperates with police and provides them with his parents' new address.
I subsequently went out to Pat and Roy Anderson's new rental out in Montville, Connecticut, and interviewed them about Gene's death. Pat Anderson, she corroborated Chad Schaefer's assessment that when they were evicted, they moved on, and there was no feelings of animosity between themselves and Gene Meloff.
Detectives still want to know where the Andersons were at the time of the murder.
Patricia Anderson worked in a nursing home. Ian said she was at home after working previously during the day.
Police ask Roy point blank if he has an alibi around the time that Eugene was murdered.
He indicated that he had worked from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. in the morning out at the Foxwoods Casino. And Dr. Meloff's van had been located in the employee parking lot of the Foxwoods Casino.
That was very suspicious to the investigator. From the crime scene to the Foxwoods Casino parking lot, it's not far, a 15-minute drive. And then you think that maybe this eviction thing was a personal thing. And we have as investigators to figure out who did it so that person can be held accountable.
Police investigating the murder of cold fusion scientist Eugene Meloff now have their first real suspect. His recently evicted tenant, Roy Anderson, works at the same casino where Eugene's stolen van was found on the night of the murder.
Roy reported that there was no animosity about the eviction. There was no problem between Eugene and Roy. But Dr. Meloff's van had been found at the Foxwoods lot.
Angered by the eviction, had Roy killed Eugene in revenge?
We got a list of names of employees that night, and we verified that Roy Anderson was in fact working from 5 p.m. until 1 a.m., and that provided him with a pretty solid alibi that he was not within the city of Norwich at all. Pat and Roy Anderson were both individuals of interest, but they had alibis.
Police want to know if anyone else was living in their house at the time of the eviction.
One of the things that we learned in talking to Pat and Roy, they would bring other people in to help pay for rooms.
We needed to obtain the location of all individuals that had lived in the house.
It turns out one of the Anderson subletters is well known to police.
Lenny Campbell was a friend of Roy's, and they allowed Lenny to stay in the basement of the house.
I personally had run into him a few times during the course of my patrol duties. I knew him to be an individual that someone would maybe not want to cross. The Andersons, when they were evicted, Lenny moved out with them to their new place.
Police want to speak to Lenny, but the Andersons say he recently packed up and left without an explanation.
He moved out shortly after Eugene's murder, and investigators thought it was suspicious.
When police try to track Lenny down, they find he's moved out of state.
Lenny Campbell was working on a farm up in Massachusetts. Lenny denied ever even having contact with Eugene Meloff.
Lenny isn't talking, and there's no evidence connecting him to the crime scene.
At this point in the investigation, we really need some solid forensic evidence that somebody was complicit in the murder of Eugene Meloff.
Police receive the autopsy report, and it sheds more light on how Eugene was killed.
The medical examiner's office indicated approximately 32 lacerations to the face and body.
And he had suffered a crushed trachea.
What possibly could have sparked such a vicious assault?
We did receive tips throughout the course of the investigation saying that it was a professional hit.
Was Eugene assassinated for his research into alternative energy?
I thought that perhaps because cold fusion was so controversial, that maybe it was some kind of planned setup.
I do believe there's always a danger to somebody that's going to rock the boat. I realized that Gene's passion for countering big oil meant that there were plenty of people out there that weren't happy with Gene.
It occurred to me that, he was doing work that might have threatened someone enough that it would have murdered him.
We delved into it, and based on the crime scene and the circumstances in which he was killed, I don't think a professional hitman would go about his business in that manner. It just didn't add up. It wasn't logical.
Police are running out of leads, but then a witness comes forward with a bizarre account from the night of the murder.
We came in contact with a shuttle driver for a nearby hotel sometime between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. on the night of the murder. He had pulled up to a traffic light and saw a van similar to the doctor's van, and he noticed the operator of the van, a white male, was wearing socks on his hands.
Obviously, you start to think, well, if the person's wearing socks on their hands, they don't want to transfer any evidence onto a steering wheel.
Whoever was driving that van with hands covered with socks was possibly complicit with the homicide. Gene Maloff's van had been moved into a fenced-in compound, and we examined it again for anything that we may have missed or the state police may have missed, and we seized a few items to include a plastic bag.
Police submit the bag to the state forensic lab for analysis.
And as a result of that, a fingerprint came back. It was the first piece of evidence that would place somebody in that van, possibly on the night of the murder.
The print is run through the police database.
The fingerprint belonged to a local individual from the Norwich area.
When we ran this person's record, they had a record of burglaries.
He was the type of guy that wouldn't have any problems breaking into your car. Maybe Eugene Maloff got killed for it.
Police have a fresh lead in the murder of Eugene Maloff. A fingerprint on a plastic bag found in the scientist's stolen van is matched to a local car burglar.
The results of that examination indicated that a print on the bag belonged to a Nicholas Gardner.
Police track the suspect down and bring him in for questioning.
He was very nonchalant about the fact that he had broken into the van, but when it was brought to his attention that that vehicle was used following a homicide, his demeanor shifted dramatically, and he became very nervous at that point.
When police grill him further, he makes a startling admission.
He said that he broke into a police impound lot.
He explained that he had broken into the impound lot and was burglarizing the cars. And that would explain how his fingerprints had been found in Mr. Maloff's van.
Police confirm his story when his prints are found on other vehicles in the lot.
Nicholas was definitely wrong place, wrong time, and had no clue that the van that he was entering was involved in the homicide of Gene Maloff.
Nicholas is charged with the burglaries, but it's a dead end in the search for Eugene's killer. Then, police get a call that reignites the case.
we received a phone call from the New Britain Police Department, 40 minutes away from the city of Norwich. A New Britain police officer had come in contact with two subjects. They were in a parking lot. They were asleep in the vehicle. It was a stolen vehicle. It had been reported stolen the same night of Dr. Malov's murder.
When the officer looked inside the car, he made an alarming discovery.
They had been found with blood inside their vehicle. And so obviously the first inclination is, whose blood is that and where did it come from?
The men are arrested and taken to the station.
When they were taken into custody, they were identified as Joseph Riley and Gary McAvoy. Officers at the scene observed that Riley and McAvoy had evidence of some kind of violent struggle.
Is it possible these two men were involved in Eugene's murder?
We wanted to either rule them into our homicide scene or rule them out.
So investigators from Norwich went up and spoke with Riley and McAvoy at the lockup in New Britain.
Police interview Riley and McAvoy in separate rooms. They press Riley about the bloodstains in the car and scratches on his arms and legs.
Joe Riley told the detectives that he and McAvoy ended up in an altercation with one another.
They both said that they got into a fight in the car, and that's how they had the blood in the car.
Investigators question the pair about Eugene's homicide.
During Riley's interview, he made some statements that really caught our attention. He asked, did the old man get the kicked out of him? But the manner of death of Gene Malov had not been relayed to Riley at that time.
How did Riley seem to know details about how Eugene was killed? McAvoy's response to questioning raises more red flags.
When the officer advised him that he was being investigated for a potential homicide, Gary McAvoy became very distraught. He indicated that he wanted to commit suicide and at one point curled up in a fetal position on the floor and was shaking and hyperventilating.
The statements provided by Riley and McAvoy were suspicious to the investigators.
Police bring in the hotel shuttle driver who claimed he saw someone driving Eugene's van on the night of the murder.
He told us that the operator of the van was a white male.
A photo array was offered to the witness, and he pointed out to Joseph Riley as the driver of the minivan that he saw that night.
Police now have a witness placing one of their suspects inside Eugene Malov's van on the night he was murdered.
Riley and McAvoy had been involved in a theft of a motor vehicle and a burglary, and they did have evidence of violent struggle, and the witness picks Riley out of a photo lineup.
Police still lack physical evidence, so they obtain the men's DNA to compare to samples collected from the crime scene and the van.
Evidence was sent up to the Connecticut State Police Forensic Laboratory.
When results come back, it's a major break.
We received a phone call from the forensic lab saying that the hair in Mr. Malov's van was a match to Mr. McAvoy. Okay, well, that's a blockbuster.
We had solid forensic evidence, and we're going to move forward with a warrant.
Riley and McAvoy are charged with Eugene's murder.
I was happy for the family that maybe they'd get some closure on this case.
But then, investigators received a disturbing call.
We thought we were on strong footing based on the solid forensic evidence from the van, and the case was going to move forward. And then a bombshell was dropped.
Joseph Riley and Gary McAvoy are charged for the murder of Eugene Malov after one of McAvoy's hairs is matched to a hair found in Eugene's van. But then, police receive news that rocks the case.
Bombshell was dropped by the state forensic lab. The lab reached out to us and said there was a mistake and that McAvoy's hair was not at the crime scene and were not in the van.
There was a clerical error at the laboratory.
And somewhere at the lab, there was confusion over the item numbers. So the hair fiber they tested, they thought came from the van, in fact, came from the hair of the suspects up in prison. And as a result, the state of Connecticut decided they were not going to pursue homicide charges against Riley or McAvoy.
We thought that we were really onto something, and that kind of fell apart.
At this point, we were back to square one.
You're telling a family who lost a loved one to violent crime that you've arrested the right people. And that falls apart, and then we say to the Maloff family, sorry, we couldn't do better.
I had to accept it, but it was a terrible thing. I would cry on the way to work, and I think when you go through a tragedy, your world becomes very small. Joanne was very upset, and I saw her break down once when we were going someplace. I was following her, and she lost her way. She just was devastated at that point.
When the investigation went on so long, I had a feeling it was just one of those random events, and we would never learn anything more of it. I think I pretty much accepted that.
The case goes cold. Then, 4 years after the murder of Eugene Maloff, the investigation is rebooted. Determined to solve the crime, Norwich PD assigned new resources to the case.
They put a task force together, and I was assigned to work with the state's attorney's office, along with Detective Terry McFadden.
Detective Curtis and I picked up on the case and basically started from day one.
Cold cases are just cases that take longer to solve than others. It was a fresh start, and it let us get to work on finding out who the real killers were.
We had met with the Maloff family and just told them that we were trying to get justice for Eugene, and we were able to secure a reward for information about Mr. Maloff's homicide, and that's not typically seen in every homicide.
The reward is advertised on a large billboard near the interstate.
We worked with the family, and we came up with the best design possible and put a billboard up where we thought that the most people would see Eugene's face and see our message to the public saying we needed help with this investigation.
After just a few weeks, the billboard starts to bring results.
The day I won't forget in this case is when we had a witness come into the police department and explain to me that they had direct information related to the death of Eugene Maloff.
The witness claims to know Candace Foster and Chad Schaefer. Chad is the son of the Andersons, the tenants Eugene evicted.
Jill Sebastian was friends with Candace Foster and Chad Schaefer, and had actually lived with them around that time of Mr. Maloff's murder. She began to tell us about how when they would see reports about Mr. Maloff's murder on the TV, Chad would start getting kind of antsy. And Candace had mentioned to Jill about Chad coming home with bloody clothing around the time of Mr. Maloff's murder.
Investigators are stunned by Jill's statement, but police have no evidence connecting Chad Schaefer to the crime scene.
Early in the investigation, an investigator went to Chad and Candace. They said that on the night of the murder, they had stayed home and there was no evidence to support any connection to Eugene's death.
Police are eager to corroborate Jill's story. Her boyfriend, Keyshawn, agrees to give a statement.
Keyshawn told us that Chad Schaefer confessed to Keyshawn that he had killed Eugene Maloff.
Obviously, it's a significant development in the case. We started to look at Candace Foster and Chad more closely.
Police learn that in the years after the murder, Chad and Candace had separated. they focus their attention on Candace.
The number one goal for us was to get information from her regarding Chad, being a participant in the murder of Dr. Eugene Maloff.
Police urge Candace to tell them everything she knows.
This is the father of her children that she's now going to be telling us about that participated in a homicide. Candace and Chad had a tumultuous relationship, and she related to us that her biggest fear for her and her children was Chad.
Detectives ask Candace about a piece of physical evidence that could tie Chad to the crime scene.
Candace told us that those keys had been hanging inside the loft at the apartment where Candace and Chad lived. And we happened to find a key ring similar at the crime scene.
The information is damning, but investigators suspect that Candace is hiding something.
Some of the things that Candace had said regarding Chad or regarding her whereabouts on the night of the murder hadn't added up. We had to let Candace know that she would have to come clean and explain to us everything she knew about the murder.
When we interviewed her, a little bit of information would come out, and then a little bit more information would come out. And then it reached a point where Candace did tell us someone other than Chad was involved in Mr. Maloff's murder.
Detectives believe Eugene Maloff was killed by his former tenant's son, Chad Schaefer. But Chad's ex-girlfriend, Candace, claims Chad wasn't the only one involved in the brutal murder.
Candace told us that Moselle Brown, he had been at the scene with Chad at the time of Mr. Maloff's murder. Moselle Brown was the cousin of Chad Schaefer.
Chad had been hanging around with Moselle a little bit more often around this time. Moselle Brown had a violent criminal past. We knew of him. We were cautious of him.
Investigators press Candace for more details about events leading up to Eugene's murder. She says it all started when a relative saw Eugene cleaning out the rental unit the Andersons had been evicted from.
Candace told us that all day long, Chad had been getting phone calls from his mom, Patricia Anderson, saying that the landlord was throwing all their things in the garbage. Patricia was really upset and starts putting out pressure on Chad. I told you, you were supposed to get that stuff out of there. You were supposed to have that house cleaned out. I want my belongings. And Chad had gotten picked up by Moselle Brown.
He told Moselle that Mr. Maloff was throwing stuff out that belonged to Chad's parents. They got upset.
And they go over there and they say, listen, we're not going to take it from this guy. Mr. Maloff says, no, get out of here. I gave you plenty of time to get your stuff out of here, leave. And someone throws a punch. They hit him once, and now once they hit him, these guys don't stop. They just start beating him. And they leave him for dead.
Following the vicious assault, the pair returned to Chad and Candace's apartment.
Candace told us that they returned. And Chad was upset, and Chad had blood on his clothing. And Chad explained to Candace that they had beaten the landlord.
But Candace's account doesn't explain how Eugene's van ended up in the casino parking lot.
Candace wasn't telling us all this stuff out of the goodness of her heart. She was doing this to minimize her involvement and minimize her punishment.
When investigators confront her about her deception, she finally cracks.
From what Candace was telling us, it looked like three of them were involved. Chad Schaefer, Moselle Brown, and Candace Foster.
Candace says she returned to the rental property with Chad and Moselle to cover up their crime.
Candace said they walked down the path to the garage to where they saw Eugene Maloff laying on the ground, and that He was still alive and still breathing, but he was severely beaten. And they realized they gotta kill him.
Candace Foster was a bit reluctant to do that, at which point they threatened her.
Chad and Moselle said if she didn't participate, that she'd be next.
It was a vicious beating with numerous strikes to the face with some unknown object.
And at that point, Eugene's still alive. And that's when Moselle steps on his throat until he stops breathing.
After killing Eugene, Chad, Moselle, and Candace staged the scene to throw police off their trail.
They wanted to make this look like it was a robbery, and part of that was that Candace drove the van and dropped it off in the casino parking lot.
With Candace's story, investigators believe they have enough evidence to charge Chad and Moselle with murder. They arrest Chad Schaefer first.
When the news came through that they actually had an arrest, it was a shock to find out that Gene was killed by a son of a disgruntled tenant. It just seemed unfair.
When investigators track down Moselle Brown, they find out he's serving time in Ohio for another crime.
We extradited him back to Connecticut to face charges for the killing of Eugene Maloff. I believe the X factor was Moselle. He was the violent ringleader, and I believe Chad Schaefer and Candace Foster would not have killed Eugene Maloff in the absence of Moselle.
The three accused are tried separately.
Moselle received more than 50 years in prison. At Chad's trial, he was defiant and ultimately took a plea deal and took the offer that the state put on the table.
Chad Schaefer agrees to plead guilty to first-degree manslaughter.
Chad Schaefer received a 25-year sentence, and he would have to serve 17.5 years.
Candace Foster is the last to face justice.
There's no way that we could have had as strong a case that we did against Moselle and Chad without Candace. And Candace, with her attorney, made an arrangement with the state's attorney's office for her to receive the sentence that she got.
Candace eventually was charged with hindering prosecution and tampering with evidence.
She served 3 years in jail and then several years of probation.
The verdicts bring closure, but nothing can replace what Gene's loved ones have lost.
I'm not a good judge as to whether justice was served, but the bottom line was that we couldn't bring back that special, wonderful man.
I think Gene would like to be remembered as somebody that advanced the deeper knowledge of the universe.
I think Gene did make a difference in the world. I think he could have made a much bigger difference had he been around longer.
I just miss Gene, and I really relish all the memories I have of all the happy times. We all loved him so much. The world has lost a great human being, a great mind, and a beautiful person.
A loving husband and father with so much to live for.
He did everything for his family. He was an amazing daddy. He loved life. He loved to be happy.
Is ruthlessly gunned down at home in front of his wife.
When he was laying there on the floor, nothing can prepare you for that.
They stood over the victim's body with a shotgun and delivered a fatal blow.
This wasn't just a random killing. This was an assassination.
Police tracked down several suspects.
She was absolutely the possible person who was involved. She had all the motive.
He began bragging about other involvements that he had had with acts of violence.
And we knew that he and the victim had some bad blood between them.
Just when police think they might never catch the killer,
We were pretty frustrated, and the wind was kind of taken out of our sails.
The case takes a mind-blowing turn.
She sang like a songbird.
He had been in possession of the guns used.
And law enforcement was pretty stunned by that.
To reveal a killer no one imagined.
This is unbelievable.
It was someone that if you passed on the street would look as innocent as they come.
The darkest, blackest soul.
Known for its white sand beaches, Panama City lies on the Gulf Coast of Florida's Panhandle.
Our biggest industry is tourism, with millions of people coming to enjoy the Gulf Coast.
The community is very tight. You know most of your neighbors, you know everybody that you do business with on a personal name basis.
But in the early hours of October 6, 1998, the town's sense of safety is rocked by a chilling 911 call.
At 3 o'clock in the morning, there was a call from a woman that her husband had been shot and killed.
There was a lot of shots. I ran back to the bedroom. The killer wasn't in the house. He was coming after us. I literally thought everybody was gonna die, and I was so scared.
Police raced to the home, expecting to encounter an active shooter.
Their first thought is clearing that house, making sure that the killer's not still in the house.
As the officer entered, the first thing that he noticed was the victim's body in the kitchen area.
When they started calling out that they were the police and they were there, the wife was in a bedroom.
She had retreated to seek safety for her and her children, which were still in the house.
This is all just happening so quickly. I don't know how I'm supposed to trust that whoever's out there is not the killer.
Officers find no sign of the gunman and assure Angelica it's safe to come out of the bedroom.
The wife came out and she was very, very hysterical.
When they walked me back out, when he was laying there on the floor, I knew he was gone. You have somebody murdering your husband and shooting you, all in seconds. Nothing can prepare you for that.
Angelica identifies the man as her husband, 30-year-old Ron Stovall.
The children were taken to Ron's parents' house. They didn't live too far away. And the victim's wife went to the police department where we could talk to her.
With Angelica and the children out of harm's way, detectives can examine the crime scene.
As a responding detective, I go in and start looking around. Ron, the victim, he had been shot 3 times in the back, once in the hip, and there was a shot to the back of the head.
Investigators find an important clue close to the victim's body.
There were some bloody footprints there on the floor. Part of those footprints had what looked like the letter H, 2 H's kind of next to each other on the sole.
Whoever was wearing that shoe had perpetrated at least part of the crime because they would have been standing in the victim's blood and then exiting the residence following the homicide.
The Stovall's front door also reveals how the murder unfolded.
We could see her husband was shot outside, and then the killer shot through the door, and he got into the house, and he had shot Ron in the back of the head.
As daylight breaks, a forensic team scours the outside of the home.
They found a handgun projectile out on the sidewalk near the driveway.
The killer shot what clearly looks like a handgun round to the lower extremities, and then you have a shotgun round to the head. This was overkill. They stood over the body and delivered a fatal blow. When you see that type of crime scene, you're looking immediately for someone that displayed some type of grudge or emotional hatred for the victim.
While forensics wrap up their investigation at the crime scene, detectives head to the police station to speak with Ron's wife, Angelica.
We really took note how emotionally overtaken she was, but she had been an eyewitness to this scene, so she was critical in our investigation.
I can't even comprehend what's going on. He was dead. I did not want to live without him. Ron was truly amazing. He was always full of life, very kind, sincere, very real.
Born in Panama City, Ron Stovall was one of 4 siblings.
He was very close with his family. He was always out doing stuff with school, doing stuff with the church.
He was well known within the community.
Ron served almost 4 years in the Navy. He had felt a commitment to his country and enjoyed his naval service.
Ron always dreamt of having a family, and in 1989, he met his first wife, Tina Trexler.
Tina and Ron got married. They had one child, they had a daughter.
The marriage was a rocky one, and after 6 years, it fell apart. Soon after, Ron met single mom Angelica at a local beach bar.
He said he knew from the second he saw me that he loved me. Our first night, we went on a date, took me to the beach, to the ocean, put out a blanket, listened to some Marvin Gaye, had Italian food. It was very romantic. He stole my heart, and I was never in love before. I just fell right into his arms.
In 1997, the couple married. Just like Ron, Angelica had a child from a previous relationship. A year later, their family of 4 became 5 when they had a daughter of their own.
Ron took on several jobs. He worked as a waiter. He worked as a delivery man for the UPS companies.
He was very dedicated, and he just got his massage therapy license. He did everything for his family. We were very happy.
Who would want to gun down this loving husband and father in cold blood? At the station, Angelica tells police how the murder unfolded.
I was able to tell the cops everything I knew, and I didn't try to hold anything back. Ron got up at about 3 o'clock every morning, and I would get up and make his lunch for him to take to work.
She explains how Ron left the house and was suddenly ambushed.
There were some shots. I didn't know what was going on. He collapsed on the ground, and the killer tried coming through the door, so I was fighting with him. He got his hand through it. I grabbed the gun, and he opened the door with his hand, and I looked down that barrel of that silver gun, and he shot it.
The bullet just misses Angelica.
I ran back to the bedroom.
As Angelica shares more details about the deadly attack, detectives gain important information about the killer.
She described him as male, brown eyes, brown hair, and that he had some type of facial hair, possibly a mustache. She indicated hearing the assailant say to Ron as he was delivering the fatal gunshot wound, "This is for her."
It sounded very evil.
Angelica tells police she doesn't know the meaning behind the killer's words.
We need to find out who her was, and we needed to find out what made this so personal to her.
Well, this wasn't just a random killing. This was an assassination, is what it was.
Investigators ask Angelica who might want Ron dead.
Immediately, she went to Tina, his ex-wife. Ms. Stovall indicated that the relationship between Ron and his ex-wife was volatile. There was a custody issue over their daughter.
Things got a little bit more sticky with the custody setup, and Ron was filing for full custody of the child.
Could the bitter custody battle have turned deadly?
This was an enormous red flag for us as a team. Whoever her was may have in fact had to do with his ex-wife.
It's probably one of the worst situations we ever deal with, is with a man and woman and children involved. It will just about make a person do anything.
Coming up, police uncover a key piece of evidence.
He brings out a shotgun round that is similar to the one that we've recovered from our crime scene,
leading to a disturbing plot.
The photo identification that made him a prime suspect.
It was his eyes. What I saw was the same person.
And a sickening betrayal no one saw coming.
They planned this whole thing.
None of us had ever worked a case like this.
I do not understand how somebody can have so much hatred.
Police investigating the cold-blooded shooting of 30-year-old Ron Stovall are looking into his relationship with his ex-wife, Tina Trexler.
We knew that there was an extreme amount of tension between Ron and his ex-wife, and there was a custody battle that was forthcoming.
Ron and Tina originally shared custody, but Ron had filed a petition basically saying that he wanted full custody of the child.
Up to this point, Tina was that individual that had the most to gain from Ron's death. Perhaps she had not been the one on scene, but it still doesn't eliminate her as having some type of involvement.
This looked like certainly an intentional and a premeditated killing. Might have been a killing for hire.
Detectives speak to Ron's friends and family to get a clearer picture of the animosity with Tina.
When Ron remarried, it was okay, but not really okay. Tina, as well as her family, did not like the new wife, and the situation deteriorated between all of them.
As Ron and Angelica's family grew, Tina's behavior appeared increasingly erratic.
Tina began feeling that Ron was trying to work Tina out of the picture as the mother, and so that had really kind of amplified the rub and the tension.
There was all this, crazy fighting, and it was too hard for his daughter. We were just concerned.
This custody hearing was coming up in about 2 or 3 weeks from when this incident happened.
Tina was absolutely a possible person who was involved in this murder. She had all the motive.
Could the custody battle have driven Ron's ex-wife to murder? Investigators bring Tina in for an interview.
One of the things that was most alarming when we sat down with Tina was that there was no remorse, no emotional activity on her part, that she was even concerned that he was dead.
When investigators ask about her relationship with Ron, Tina's answer is surprising.
We knew there were a lot of hostilities, but when Tina was interviewed, she kind of painted that the relationship with them was cordial, it was friendly. It's a red flag for us as investigators because she's already showing signs of deceit.
With suspicions raised, detectives grilled Tina about her whereabouts in the hours leading up to Ron's murder.
She told us the night before the homicide, she had went to work at a local restaurant. She was a bartender. She got off sometime between 11 and midnight. She had went home and sat and watched TV with her mother. Then after that she had went to bed, and at the time of the homicide itself, she had been home asleep.
Before police can press Tina further, the interview is interrupted.
Her mother had hired a lawyer for her.
The attorney made contact with Tina and immediately ended the interview.
Unable to finish questioning Tina, detectives look into her alibi.
Police were able to establish that she had been at work that night till 11:30, 12 o'clock.
Investigators also speak with Tina's mother, Ann Trexler.
She was the grandmotherly type and was helping Tina get back on her feet and help her get through this divorce.
And come across as a very down-to-earth, nice lady, a housewife, and she confirmed that Tina had been at the house with her watching TV.
Though Tina's alibi checks out, police still theorize that she could have hired someone to kill her ex-husband.
We conducted a preliminary investigation into her financial records. Everything was consistent with that of just a working-class individual making normal purchases.
1 week into the investigation with no concrete evidence pointing at Tina, police look for other suspects. They quickly discover Tina wasn't the only one in a dispute with Ron.
Tina had a boyfriend. His name was Adrian Harris, and there had been some confrontations between Ron and Mr. Harris regarding the way Ron was treating Tina. And in fact, at one point, there had been some threats made on Harris's part.
Had Adrian decided to confront Ron, leading to deadly consequences.
As we began looking into Mr. Harris, whether he was paid to do it or whether he did it on his own, we weren't sure, but the concern was that he may have perpetrated this to make good with Tina for the purpose of helping her
Investigators tracked down Adrian over 900 miles away near Baltimore.
When we talked with Adrian, he did acknowledge that there was some bad blood between the two of them, but he really kind of downplayed the significance.
The day of the murder, he told us he went to work.
He had clocked in before 7:30, and the time of Ron's death was 3:30 in the morning.
Detectives checked travel times between Baltimore and Panama City.
There was not enough time to get to Panama City from several states away to do the murder and go back home.
While Adrian is ruled out, someone close by catches the investigators' attention.
We talked to his roommate, Guy McInvale.
When the officers went to talk to Adrian's roommate, they discovered the description of the killer that Angelica gave to the law enforcement. The roommate fitted quite well.
Guy McInvale had brown eyes, brown hair, and he had a mustache. Now we had another individual that we want to look at.
Once we saw him, Guy fit the description. He was a roommate with Adrian Harris, and we knew that Harris and the victim had some bad blood between them. We thought maybe he went there to kill him.
Is this the break police have been hoping for? Investigators rush to confirm if Guy is a true match for the gunman.
We got pictures of him to show the victim's wife, Angelica. See if he could have been the one that she saw that night.
Back in Panama City, detectives include the picture of Guy into a photo lineup.
Angelica was an essential witness.
She was a witness who can identify the individual that did the crime. Her photographic identification, it was surprising.
It has been 2 weeks since 30-year-old father, Ron Stovall, was shot to death at home in front of his wife, Angelica. Now, detectives hope she can identify the shooter from a photo lineup.
She picked out Guy McInvale as being the killer.
It was his eyes. There was something very, very similar. What I saw was the same person.
There was an identification of Guy McInvale that made him a prime suspect.
We have Miss Stovall's positive identification of Guy as the individual that was in front of their house. There's a sense of relief that begins to sweep through the unit because you're finally on to a really developing hot lead. We want to now try to establish what type of physical evidence do we actually have between the victim, Ron, and Guy.
Detectives get a search warrant and race over to Guy's Baltimore residence. They make a telling discovery.
We search his items, and looking at me right square in the face was a pair of shoes consistent with the shoe impression that we had at the scene. So we're moving in the right direction.
Police bring Guy to the local police station for questioning.
Although we still were missing the key pieces of evidence, the guns and such as that, we really felt like we're starting to put together the edges of the puzzle. In speaking with Guy, what he provided us for an alibi was that he was in Maryland working. At the end of work, he went home, slept. The next day he got up, went to work, and so that was his alibi.
Detectives check out Guy's story.
We had had an opportunity to speak with Guy at his place of employment, and we were able to collect some video that correlated with his timeline of what he said. There was physically no way possible for him to have been here in Panama City at the time of the crime.
It turned out that what Guy McInvale said to the police was correct. Guy had an alibi.
Eager to further prove his innocence, Guy volunteers to take a polygraph.
He successfully passed that. So we were able to clear Mr. McInvale.
For police, it's a disappointing setback.
We were pretty frustrated, and it's a roller coaster. It's one of those, now you're back in the lows again, and the wind was kind of taken out of our sails.
Angelica wanted to help the officers along, but her perception at the time of the event was clouded by the terror, the trauma of the incident itself.
I remember him being the same person. It stuck in my head like that, but I was wrong.
It's difficult when you see something that quick that you can say, okay, this is the individual that did the crime.
We thought we had this thing solved, but you just got to go regroup, see what you still have to do, and you just start from there.
Desperate for new leads, investigators review Ron's autopsy report.
The autopsy confirmed 2 different weapons. They told us that it was a .357 round that he had been shot with, plus the shotgun shell. One big thing we learned was that shotgun residue got in his face. We think that Ron was laying there on the floor, and this guy's saying this is for her, and he presses that shotgun to the back of his head, and Ron's looking at him when that went off.
The forensics report contains another crucial detail that could lead police to the killer.
These were close proximity rounds, and so we knew that this was something personal. And the shotgun shell was paramount. It was a unique round. We would be able to identify it. So that was a plus in our corner.
Detectives shared details of the firearms with local law enforcement, hoping to track down their owner.
We work so closely with the different police departments in the area. We talk to them all the time in case something turns up.
As investigators continue to search for answers, Ron's loved ones struggle with their grief.
The best thing in my life was that life. I didn't think I was strong enough to go through anything without him. He was always full of life. Losing your soulmate, you can't even explain how much pain that was. It still is. It'll never go away.
3 weeks after Ron's murder, the investigation is threatening to grow cold, but then police receive a tip that reignites the case.
We got a call from the Panama City Beach Police Department. They had a home invasion out there on the beach. During that arrest, they recovered 2 handguns and a short-barreled shotgun.
They knew from the investigation of the crime scene where Ron Stovall was killed that a shotgun had been used and that a handgun had been used.
That coincides with what we're looking for. We wanted to go over the evidence they had and the circumstances.
Could these be the weapons connected to Ron's murder?
The gentleman that they arrested, we started looking into him and looking at his background and everything. And he had a pretty lengthy criminal history, had actually been linked to some murders in the past. He really caught our attention. This turned out to be a big break.
Police in Panama City are investigating the cold-blooded homicide of husband and father Ron Stovall. They now believe the missing murder weapons were used in a home invasion robbery less than 15 miles away.
When meeting with this investigator from the Beach Police Department, what he produced from his crime scene was this: a handgun and a sawed-off shotgun. That coincides with what we're looking for. Then he brings out a shotgun round that is similar to the one that we've recovered from our crime scene. We have everything that meets the parameters. Now we really believe we're on the right path.
The weapons are sent off to the crime lab. While detectives await the results, they dig deeper into this new lead.
At the Beach Police Department, they identified the individual as Tony Alberto Perez. He went by Tony. He had an extensive criminal history. There was some acts of violence in his past, or some drugs in his past. They really felt like he was a pretty violent individual.
Another detail catches their attention.
Tony had brown eyes, brown hair, and facial hair. He looks just like our guy. He met Miss Stovall's physical description to a T.
Investigators head to the nearby jail where Tony is being held for the home invasion.
He come across as a kind of a likable guy. He was laughing and cutting up, but the more he talked, more red flags went up. He began bragging about other involvements that he had had with acts of violence. He was completely nonchalant about it.
Detectives turn up the heat and asked Tony if he killed Ron Stovall.
Tony totally denied any involvement, any knowledge of Ron, any knowledge of anything that may have happened on that date, and basically told law enforcement, it's not me, I'm not the person.
Despite Tony's denials, investigators believe he's withholding information, and they obtain a search warrant.
Tony Perez had items that he owned stored at the landlord's house, and we're searching through Tony Perez's items over there. And then we find a pair of work boot type shoes.
While inspecting the footwear, detectives notice a key detail.
Those work boots had what looked like the letter H, two H's kind of next to each other on the sole. It looked like what we had found at the crime scene. And we got those sent right off to the lab.
As police hunt for more incriminating evidence against Tony, the ballistic results come back.
And we actually got confirmation from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement that the guns collected that Tony had been in possession of matched perfectly ballistically to the rounds that we had recovered from our scene.
That evidence right there is one of the biggest things you could have in any murder case. You can find the weapons and find a person who has the weapons. That's major.
So now that we can put Tony, at least the guns, at the scene, that gave us the ability to change gears with Tony. We had the information and ammunition that we needed to confront Tony about what really happened.
Detectives head back to the jail to interview their prime suspect.
As Tony began to kind of spin his version of what happened to Ron, now he acknowledged having a little knowledge of it, but he said that he had loaned his guns to someone else and that he didn't know what they did with them. He didn't have any involvement in it. But what he says is that he had heard Ron was dealing drugs, and that's why he was killed.
We had already done a thorough background on Ron. We knew Ron was not involved in any drug business. We had talked to too many people. He was a happily married man trying to make it in life. That's what Ron was.
Then Tony gave us information that would kind of put us on some individuals that might be involved, and we tracked those individuals down, and we were able to confirm 100% that they had nothing to do with Ron's death.
People sometimes, when they are being questioned, especially when the police have some of the goods on them, will make up stories. And that's what Perez did. As far as the police could determine, that was a total concoction by Tony Perez.
Detectives believe Tony is lying, but wonder what motive he could have to kill Ron.
We were still kind of struggling to establish how Tony would have came into Ron's life.
Going through Tony's belongings, we found some cell phone bills there, and they were linked to the name of Kim Miller. Kim Miller turned out to be Tony's girlfriend. So we went to talk to Kim.
Kim Miller is the owner of a Panama City hair salon.
Tony and Kimberly, they had been in a romantic relationship for several months.
We were told by Kim that Tony, he was doing odd things for her. He would come around the hair salon and he would actually shampoo customers' hair, clean up, sweep up the shop, things like that.
Investigators look for a connection between Tony and Ron Stovall.
Kim was familiar with the Stovall homicide. She claims that she first heard about it because she had a customer that had called in and canceled her hair appointment, saying how her ex-son-in-law had been murdered.
When detectives ask Kim for the customer's name, they receive a startling response.
The connection kind of came out of nowhere and almost as a surprise.
Kim's client is Ann Trexler, who happens to be Tina's mother. Tina, Ron's ex-wife.
Police believe husband and father Ron Stovall was shot and killed by criminal Tony Perez. They're now exploring a potential link between Tony and Ron's ex-wife, Tina Trexler.
When Kim Miller indicated that she styled Tina's mother, Ann Trexler's hair, and law enforcement was pretty stunned by that.
Ann Trexler is the mother of Ron's ex-wife, Tina.
We knew of the ongoing hostilities between Ron and Tina. So when we talked with Kim Miller, we asked her if she had ever met Tina, his ex-wife, and she did met her on a couple of occasions. Tina's mother, Ann, however, was a regular client, was in there on a regular basis.
With Tina previously eliminated from the investigation, detectives asked Kim more about Tina's mother, 52-year-old Ann Trexler.
She told us that Ann's talking to her and telling her about these problems with her daughter going through this custody battle with her ex-husband. And she was upset about it. She's afraid she's going to lose her grandchild.
Ann had told Kimberly the Trexlers had to get a second mortgage on their home to provide legal assistance to Tina.
Could the custody battle be the motive behind Ron's murder?
At that point, we were trying to determine exactly who she was. She hadn't really been on our radar at all. We knew that she was Tina's mom. We knew that she was Tina's alibi at the time of this crime.
Ann Trexler, no criminal history, supposedly a wonderful grandmother and fine Christian lady who would never be involved in something like this.
Investigators contact Ron's wife, Angelica, and learn his custody dispute with Tina brought out a different side to his former mother-in-law.
Apparently they had a good relationship when Tina and them were married, but it was just a constant battle over visitation rights. Always just such a fight with her.
Looking to see if Ann could have anything to do with Ron's murder, detectives bring her in for an interview.
When we talked to her, she stated to us that there was no way that she had anything to do with killing him. She did not want him dead. Matter of fact, she said she loved him. And then Ann Trexler wanted a lawyer. And once they get a lawyer, you're done talking.
So we're kind of getting a heightened sense of concern as far as her involvement in the case, because she decided to basically not cooperate with the investigation.
Having hit a wall with Ann, detectives get a breakthrough when forensics results arrive.
We got confirmation that Tony's boot was consistent with the shoe impression that we had at the scene. Also, Tony had been in possession of the guns used. Now you've got a personal item putting him at the crime scene. At that point, we knew we had our shooter.
That's a big piece of evidence right there.
We were able to go back to Tony and present him with what we knew.
He admitted killing Ron. His very words were, "Okay, I did it." It's the shortest confession to a murder I've ever taken in my career.
Investigators push Tony to reveal how the crime unfolded, and what he tells them is shocking.
Tony told us that Ann Trexler wanted to have her ex-son-in-law killed and was willing to pay to have it done. When we found out Ann Trexler wanted to hire somebody to kill Ron, I mean, this is unbelievable. Ex-mother-in-law gonna get involved and have pay somebody to kill her ex-son-in-law?
He had met Ann at the hair salon. She was complaining about Ron, and that the two of them had worked out a deal for Tony to kill Ron in exchange for about $10,000 to be paid to Tony.
On November 10, 1998, Tony is charged with the first-degree murder of Ron Stovall. But the case is far from over. Detectives turn their attention back to alleged mastermind Ann Trexler. Searching for answers, detectives pull Ann's phone records.
The phone records were a treasure trove of information. They showed a lot of phone traffic between Kim Miller and Antonio Perez and Ann Trexler.
It clearly looks like Kimberly was the middle person between Ann and Tony.
There were phone calls between the Trexler house and Kim Miller at strange hours of the night for strange amounts of time that could not be explained away by saying, "We're setting up our rinse and set." Another thing, we were able to show that Ann Trexler received a phone call from Kim Miller the morning right after Ron's death. So there were links to tie Ann Trexler to this plot, but there was no hard, concrete connection of evidentiary value. We needed something else that would show that Ann, in fact, had hired Antonio Perez to kill Ron Stovall.
Tony Perez, he says that he had come to an agreement with Ann Trexler to kill Ron. for $10,000.
Detectives scour Ann's financial records for any signs she had commissioned Ron's murder.
We have withdrawals from her banking accounts that coincide with when Tony says he was paid and the amount that he was paid. So now we have proof that what Tony's telling us is accurate regarding being paid. With regards to Ann, none of us had ever worked a case like this. So it was kind of a shock that all of these pieces were kind of lining up to support she is the motivation to this entire crime.
But we felt like we still could not make the case against Dan Trexler. We needed someone to corroborate what Tony Perez said. We needed somebody else that can draw the line between the money and the murder of Ron Stovall.
We have to go back to the middleman in the case, which is Kim Miller.
She's the whole key to this thing.
She was looking at criminal charges, but without her, we're not going to get Ann. She is the only way that we're going to have true accounts of what happened.
We went and picked up Kim Miller and brought her in.
Kim Miller, she stonewalled. She said, no, I'm not talking to you. I'm not telling you anything.
Investigators working the Ron Stovall homicide have charged shooter Tony Perez with murder and believe the mastermind is Ron's former mother-in-law, Ann Trexler. But to build an ironclad case, they need Tony's girlfriend and go-between, Kim Miller, to share what she knows. However, Kim is refusing to talk.
It really wasn't until we actually laid out in front of her the phone records and drew the lines between Ann and her and Tony that we were able to convince her to cooperate with the investigation.
We let her know, she was going to be charged with accessory to the murder, and she's facing life in prison.
Prosecutors offer Kim a deal, a reduced sentence in exchange for testifying against Ann Trexler. Eventually, Kim takes the deal.
Kim sang like a songbird.
Kimberly was very adamant that there was a deep-seated hatred for Ron on Ann Trexler's part.
She indicated that on many occasions, Van Trexler ranted and raved about Ron Stovall, how bad he was, that he was going to remove her granddaughter. She wished that somebody would take him out, and it got more and more. Finally, Kim said, okay, if you're really serious, I know somebody who might help you.
Kim lets her know that her boyfriend, Tony Perez, will get rid of him for $10,000. And that's how the deal came about.
Kim then reveals how in the early hours of October 6th, Tony drove to the Stovall house to lie in wait for Ron.
About 3 o'clock in the morning, when Ron went out to his vehicle, Tony took a shot at him with a pistol. And Ron ran inside and slammed the door behind him, and Tony Perez fired more shots, which struck Ron in the back.
To finish Ron off, Tony tried to force his way inside the house.
Angelica, she tried to hold the door, and Tony Perez fired a shot that almost struck her. She ran to the other room to call 911.
Tony Perez came in, and he found Ron on the floor and walked up with a shotgun, said, this is for her. Boom. He killed Ron Stovall right there.
When he made the statement, this is for her, it's our belief that Tony was doing this on Ann's behalf.
Tony came there to do one thing, and that was to kill Ron Stovall.
Once he had made his getaway, he was able to reach out to Kimberly and make notice to her that, in fact, the job had been done. And then, of course, she notified Ann.
Kim swears Ron's ex-wife, Tina Trexler, wasn't involved in their murderous plan.
Law enforcement looked at Tina Trexler. Her mother, Ann, may have confided in her, but no one could get to that much evidence to put Tina in the situation of taking Ron's life.
Ann Trexler, she tried to be the grandmotherly type, but she planned this whole thing.
Ann Trexler's thought pattern was Ron Stovall is getting ready to take my only precious granddaughter away from me, and I won't have visitation, and he left my daughter. He married somebody else. He should not be able to get away with this.
From an investigator's perspective, Ann carried just as much weight as Tony. Without Ann, Tony would not have even known who Ron Stovall was.
On February 15th, 2000, Ann Trexler is formally charged with the murder of her former son-in-law, Ron Stovall.
And the cops called and he said, got her, she's in jail. She is morbidly evil. The darkest, blackest soul ever. And then she'll put on a face like she's just Miss Innocent. The killer, he didn't know Ron. Ann knew Ron. I do not understand how somebody can have so much hatred in their body, in their mind, in their heart.
In court, shooter Tony Perez pleads guilty and is sentenced to life without parole. In February 2000, Kim Miller is sentenced to 5 years probation as part of her deal with prosecutors. Finally, in 2001, Ann's trial begins, and she pleads not guilty.
Ann Trexler took the stand. She testified about not being involved. She testified about her concerns of her grandchild and the fact that she had absolutely no involvement.
On May 14th, 2001, the jury finds Ann Trexler guilty of first-degree murder. She's sentenced to life in prison without parole.
There's a little piece. I'm in a little piece in this horrible thing. A little justice, I guess.
Gets a little emotional sometimes. It's not just me. You know, we're a whole team working this thing. We celebrated, I'll just say that. We celebrated this.
The most striking thing to me is that these are all ordinary people. And it's a little bit frightening to think that people who are walking around living everyday, ordinary lives would be capable of this.
The one that initiated it all was someone that if you passed on the street would look as innocent as they come.
For Ron's family, his loss continues to be deeply felt.
I miss him and I love him so much. My poor daughter, she never got the honor she deserved. She never got her daddy. We celebrate his life all the time. He loved life. He loved to be happy. And I've tried so hard to keep his memory alive. Very much so. I will never forget how amazing Ron was.
A young mother on the verge of a new beginning.
She always used to talk about her wedding. She had everything planned out.
She was gonna be living the life that she's always dreamt of having.
Violently struck down.
Not just homicide, but an act of rage.
I had no idea why somebody would want to do that.
Police chase a deranged killer down a sinister path.
He was a big heroin dealer in Jackson. Someone burned the house down.
Through a maze of twisted theories.
Maybe this was a retaliation.
That was probably self-induced.
You mean suicide?
Yeah.
Until the case takes a mind-bending turn.
He looked at me and said, "You have it all wrong."
That person never was on our radar.
Just an epic tragedy.
I was almost in disbelief.
That's just something that was entirely unexpected from the beginning.
Until we try to rule them in or rule them out, I don't know that any of us are safe.
On Sunday, August 10th, 2014, in an upper-middle-class neighborhood in Jackson, Michigan, a quiet morning is broken by a desperate phone call.
Our dispatch did receive a 911 call from a panicked individual.
911. Yeah, I need somebody out to my house right now. She has it. I think she's dead.
Okay, where has she been sick?
No, there's blood everywhere.
Do you know where it's coming from?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, can you tell if she's breathing?
She's not. She's cold. She's dead. Oh my God.
Police race to the home just before 11 a.m., where they're greeted by the caller and 3 young girls.
He had said that the deceased body was up in a bedroom upstairs. There was 2 bedrooms that we walked past, which were bedrooms where the kids had been sleeping.
With the 3 children who lived there safely out of the house and the crime scene locked down, detectives come upon a grisly sight.
As we enter the bedroom, then we do see the body. It was slumped down between the bed and the wall. And there was quite a bit of blood. At that point, we see zip ties on her hands, and we see what appears to be several stab marks.
A zip tie was wrapped around each wrist, with another looped through it and cut, as though she'd been strapped to the bed and then cut loose.
We, at that point, determined we likely had a homicide.
The police talk to Eric Wolf, who placed the 911 call. He tells them the victim is his fiancée, 28-year-old Frances Craig. He also makes a startling admission.
He said that he had worked all night, so when he came home, after finding Franny in the condition she was in, he then went downstairs and slept on the recliner chair. For whatever reason, he did not call 911 until a couple hours later in the morning.
Frances's 2 daughters and Eric's little girl were all in the house at the time. While Eric slept, his 10-year-old child walked into a horrifying scene.
Eric's daughter, Lexi, went into the bedroom and clearly could tell that something was amiss. She even touched her and could tell that she was not moving. I think she might even have described her as a little cold.
Lexi went downstairs and woke up her father. And that's when he finally called 911.
We all felt that a normal, average individual would, at the bare minimum, make sure their fiance, the person they're about to get married to and spend the rest of their life with, is okay.
Eric's decision to walk away from the murder scene is a red flag for investigators. And so is his casual demeanor.
When Eric was interviewed by one of the other detectives at the scene initially, the detective said he didn't seem too concerned, didn't seem too upset about what had happened.
Detectives plan to grill Eric about his suspicious behavior. But first, they need to finish processing the crime scene.
There was approximately 90 stab wounds, and they were in a very aggressive manner.
It was overkill. Not just committing a homicide, but an act of rage where it's over the top.
The rule of thumb is on a situation where there's multiple, and I'm talking more than a dozen stab wounds, it's usually a crime of passion. So at that point, you typically look at somebody close to the victim.
Investigators sift through the bloody mess for clues. There's no sign of a murder weapon, but plenty of signs of conflict.
The crime lab, which is the CSI people, they responded to the scene. They were there for multiple hours, collecting a ton of evidence.
While the forensics team works the scene inside, shocked friends and family have gathered outside the house.
I didn't believe her. I thought it was a lie. It's not real. It didn't happen.
I had no idea why somebody would want to do that. Frances was just an amazing person all around. Frances and I worked together. We hung out outside of work together. We would hang out with our kids.
investigators learned that Frances had 2 daughters with an ex-boyfriend. The oldest is 5 years old, and the youngest is 3.
Our boyfriends actually were friends, and he brought her to my house one day, and that was like the beginning of a beautiful friendship. It felt like we've known each other for years. She's a wonderful, amazing mom, the best mom that I know. She was the best person I've ever met and known in my life.
She would do anything for anyone.
Frances and the father of her children broke up, but she still dreamed of getting married.
She always used to talk about her wedding and everything, and at this point, she didn't even have a boyfriend. She had everything planned out.
Dreams became reality in 2012 when she started dating 29-year-old Eric Wolf.
Eric was a divorced single father, 1 young child. He had primary custody over her.
2 years into the relationship, Eric and Frances moved in together. Despite working 2 jobs, Frances did all she could to make time for her children and Eric's daughter, too.
She was constantly doing things with her girls when she wasn't working. Even with her stepdaughter, she was amazing.
Her days were long, but her life was full. Eric proposed, and the couple bought a house together.
Frances was very, very excited about getting married. Like, every day she was tagging me on Facebook or, like, sending me pictures. You know, she thought she was gonna be living the life that she's always dreamt of having and having that fairy tale wedding.
But when detectives pressed Franny's friends, they learned that Eric had a dark side.
They told me that they weren't super fond of her fiance.
Because my daughter spent a lot of time with Frances. She was like a second mother to my daughter. And my daughter did tell me several times of Eric being kind of like a drill sergeant. He seemed real cocky, just everything was about him and his daughter more so than Frances and her girls. I felt in my gut from the moment I found out that something happened to Frances, I felt like Eric had something to do with it. I didn't know what, I didn't know how, I didn't know why. I just felt like it was because of him that she's gone.
Police are determined to get to the bottom of Eric's suspicious behavior.
When we interviewed him, he stated when he saw her in the condition she was in, he did not call 911, and he didn't seem too upset about what had happened. At that point, he was somebody, definitely a person of interest in the homicide of Franny Craig.
Coming up, Eric's story gets stranger by the minute.
I didn't know if this was, you know, like self-inflicted accident.
That's what we need to find out too.
A tiny clue reveals a big surprise.
There was DNA found on Franny's zip tie.
And when police find the killer, it shocks everyone.
I remember thinking to myself, I'm glad we're sitting down right now.
After calling 911 following the brutal murder of his fiancée, Frances Craig, Eric Wolf is questioned by police about how he discovered his fiancée's body.
I came home this morning because I work 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. I went upstairs, I checked both the girls' rooms before going in our bedroom.
Okay, so you came around to the foot of the bed and kind of looked to see where she was at.
That's exactly what I did.
Okay. Did you see anything on the mattress when you first came in?
I saw, I guess I might have saw that streak, but it didn't jump out like blood or anything.
Okay, so you saw something that just didn't jump out to you.
Yeah,
so this is bad.
Eric did not seem to register surprise, anger, hurt, anything that I think we all normally would want to see from a loved one when somebody is killed.
I thought maybe she had been drinking or something because she was in like almost like a funny position on the floor, which she doesn't drink hardly ever. I knew better than to wake her. I know from prior experience whenever I've woken her up, she's not a morning person and I get yelled at.
As the interview creeped close to an hour, Eric suggests a much darker reason for ignoring his fiancée sprawled out on the bedroom floor.
Up until just now, maybe since we've been here, I thought that if it wasn't an accident, then it was probably self-induced.
You mean suicide?
Yeah.
He indicated that he thought maybe she had committed suicide and just did not want to deal with it at that point. We found that being very odd and a red flag. Typically on a suicide, you'll find one stab wound or one gunshot wound. You won't find multiple stab wounds.
The prospect of Franny inflicting 90 stab wounds with her hands zip-tied sounds preposterous to the police. Even if it was physically possible, why wouldn't Eric have reacted with alarm?
So you didn't want to come to grips with it if she had done so. Right, because you don't want to.
To investigators, Eric's shifting story doesn't add up. Why would a woman everyone described as happy and carefree take her own life?
And the only reason I say self-induced is just because of how high-strung everything is right before this wedding, and
it's a lot of stress.
Yeah.
Eric's strange comments could signal that he's traumatized over the death of his fiancée, or that he's hiding something. Determined to mine the truth, detectives decide to go right at their prime suspect.
Did you?
No.
Know what?
No, I didn't do this. I didn't know anything about it. I walked in and I walked out, went to sleep, got up, went back in and reported it.
But that brings me back to the questions we just asked. You made it at least halfway into that bedroom.
I did make it, and I admit that, and I'll admit that in front of whoever needs to hear it. But I want to make that perfectly clear that my stance on this is exactly what I said. I went in for whatever reason it was. I didn't react.
Without forensic evidence to hold him, Eric is free to go. But investigators vow to keep their eye on him. And the deeper they look, the more circumstantial evidence starts to build up.
We did do a pretty thorough background, as we always do. And one thing we found out is that Eric did have a little bit of assaultive past with prior girlfriends and an ex-wife. It seems like he has some violent tendencies.
One of the strangest facts in this case is that Eric Wolf has a father who is serving a life sentence in prison for his own first-degree murder conviction.
He was convicted on a cold case homicide investigation in the 90s and was serving life in prison for murder. So that certainly put up a red flag to us.
Was it possible that violent tendencies run in the family? Even if they did, what possible reason would Eric have to want his fiancée dead?
The homicide occurred in August, and I believe their wedding was planned in September. We talked with her parents and her friends. They told me that Franny had second thoughts, and they were trying to convince her that if she was not prepared to get married, that maybe she should wait. And they also said Eric had second thoughts. Eric may have got cold feet, didn't want to get married, didn't know how to end the relationship.
While police work diligently to prove Eric's guilt, Frances's friends wait and wonder.
We didn't know what was going on. Nobody knew what was going on and what happened with Frances and how she was murdered. We just knew she was dead.
Behind the scenes, police work tirelessly. They obtain a search warrant to collect Frances's and Eric's electronics, but quickly realize that Frances's cell phone is missing.
We do find the cell phone near Franny's house. It had been thrown up against a tree and damaged. Again, we're thinking that the cell phone has some pretty valuable information.
The cellular phone data quite often can be some of the most compelling evidence.
We were able to get the phone records, and nothing really stuck out as being her, Franny communicating with anybody that would give us suspicion.
With no unusual cell phone activity or signs of forced entry on the day of the murder, police stay focused on Eric.
Eric Wolf at the time was at work, and investigators went and checked out, what they could to verify his alibi.
Police checked the company's security cameras.
They do have one entrance. They do have a time card check-in, check-out system. We're able to verify he was at work, or allegedly at work, when the incident occurred. The problem with the system is there's some other exits that they're not supposed to use, but some of them have cameras, but other ones do not.
Was he able to leave his place of employment and get home to commit a murder and have all of that be undetected? Eric was the only person we could figure who would have any reason to want Franny dead.
Police investigating the homicide of 28-year-old Frances Craig cannot confirm her fiancé's alibi, since not every exit at his workplace had a security camera.
We couldn't rule out that sometime during the night he left and then came back.
Eric's shaky alibi and suspicious behavior at the crime scene doesn't give police enough to arrest him, but it does leave them with a drastic course of action.
If you are operating in a murder investigation thinking that man killed his fiancée in the home where the children were, you are thinking, we want to keep the children safe. We kept Eric's daughter from him while we tried to figure out what happened to Franny.
Both Eric's and Franny's daughters are removed from Eric's home and put in the custody of family members. With pressure mounting, detectives need to move fast to prove their theory, or find a more plausible one.
At that point, we try to determine any communication Franny may have been having with someone other than her fiancé.
Franny had an ex-boyfriend. He no longer lived in the area, but he had returned to the area recently and had some level of connection or interaction with Franny.
The police press Franny's ex. Could he have committed this heinous crime?
That young man was a nice young man, came from a very, very nice family.
And he did have an alibi where he was at the time of the incident. We were able to verify that alibi, so we were able to eliminate him.
If no one in Frances's immediate circle wished her harm, what about her coworkers? Detectives learned that while Frances worked at a retail store, she was involved in a frightening incident.
Where Franny was working, there was a couple shoplifters that had stolen some clothing. She confronted them.
The confrontation turned to violence when the mother of the two young shoplifters jumped in, attacking Frances. The assault left Frances with a severe eye injury, as well as emotional scars.
The incident at work left Frances really scared, nervous, cautious.
The mother of the shoplifters was actually criminally charged for a crime for the assault, some type of unarmed robbery. She was convicted.
So there was some concern that maybe this was a retaliation for that situation.
We did surprise them with a visit. They did have alibis on where they would have been at that time that the incident occurred.
Investigators are able to verify those alibis, eliminating the women as suspects. frustrated detectives are still hoping that DNA from the crime scene will help them find the killer. But while they wait for results from the crime lab, the people of Jackson attend Franny's funeral, their emotions raw from the news of her violent death.
Her mail carrier showed up to her funeral because she left such an impact on that person. That's how loved and how missed Frances Craig is.
This was definitely a shock to the community because we don't have that many homicides.
I was scared. I just didn't know what to expect.
I was afraid to leave the house. I was afraid to do anything because we still had no answers as to what happened.
The overwhelming feeling was the pressure we were under to get this right.
Determined to find justice for Franny, investigators continued to drill down on Frances's fiancé. Hoping for an inside look at Eric Wolf, they bring in one of the couple's former roommates.
Ryan Marshall was friends with Eric Wolf. So Eric and Franny welcomed Ryan into their home to stay with them.
His house had caught on fire, and she was trying to help a friend out.
He lived with them until April of 2014. The homicide happened August of 2014, so he had a pretty good knowledge of the two of them. He said everything was good, and he actually vouched for Eric, saying Eric was a really good guy and a friend for a long time, and doesn't feel that Eric would ever do anything to harm Franny.
Speaking with Ryan doesn't give police new reasons to suspect Eric, but it doesn't clear him either.
3 months in, we've pretty much eliminated everybody of interest, anyone close to Franny other than Eric. But we don't have enough evidence to present to the prosecutor.
But then, a new piece of information arrives that brings a new suspect into the spotlight.
There was DNA found on Franny's zip tie.
Three months after Frances Craig's murder, the lab results from the crime scene finally arrive, and they provide a huge break in the case.
We're notified through a national index. The DNA located on the zip ties matched DNA in a database.
When somebody commits a felony, they have to submit to a DNA test. Somebody's DNA showed up on the zip ties that were used in the homicide. We get a name of Cortez Butler.
Who is Cortez Butler? Police waste no time looking into his criminal record.
We find out Cortez Butler served approximately 25 years for murder and was currently on parole in the Detroit area.
But we knew almost nothing else. We tried to determine if we could connect Cortez Butler to Franny Craig, to Eric Wolf, and we came up with nothing. We tried to determine if he had family locally, and we came up with nothing.
In fact, Cortez Butler appears to have no connection to Jackson whatsoever.
So we look in our database to see if we have any Cortez Butlers in any police report we've done, any place in Jackson County, and we find none.
Then it was this mad scramble of, well, then how do we even tie Cortez Butler to this? For all we know, he may have worked at Home Depot, and his DNA may be on these zip ties for a completely innocent reason.
The investigators connected with Cortez's parole officer. They got Cortez's phone number. A search warrant was prepared and signed for Cortez Butler's phone records. we learned that Cortez Butler's phone was in Jackson on the early morning hours of August 10th, the actual time of the murder. The rest of those phone records almost exclusively placed it in and around the greater Detroit area, never in Jackson.
But what reason would Butler have to harm Franny?
Eric remained the prime suspect. He was the only dude with a motive.
Maybe Eric was not ready to get married and didn't know how to end a relationship.
So then the thought process was, did Eric hire this person to kill Franny?
The cell phone records also connect Butler to some other shady characters.
We were able to identify a Clifford and Rodney McKee as being connected to Cortez Butler. Clifford McKee lived in the Detroit area. Clifford McKee was in prison for approximately 20 years for murder. We found out that Rodney McKee, he was a big heroin dealer in Jackson. We found out that he had committed arson.
The arson that Rodney McKee perpetrated was against Donna and Ryan Marshall.
The police are stunned. Ryan Marshall is Eric Wolf's friend, the one who had been welcomed into Franny and Eric's home after his house burned down. But what kind of a connection could Ryan possibly have to a drug dealer like Rodney McKee?
Ryan Marshall's mother had been a heroin dealer for Rodney McKee.
But after months of dealing for Rodney, Ryan's mother decided she wanted out.
Donna Marshall refused to sell heroin for Rodney McKee.
Rodney didn't like to be told no.
Ryan's mother, Donna, held her ground, but Rodney retaliated.
Rodney McKee attempted to burn down a house with Ryan Marshall and his mother in it.
Ryan witnessed it all. He then contacted the police.
What was the connection between Eric Wolf, Cortez Butler, the Marshalls, and a drug dealer from Detroit? Detectives knew there was only one person who could answer the question, and soon they'd have a chance to ask him face to face.
Cortez Butler was arrested for yet another murder. Not Franny's murder, but another murder in the greater Detroit area.
We went down there in Detroit with one sole purpose: to gather information from Cortez Butler on what happened to Franny and hopefully be able to explain to us what Eric's role in this whole thing was. But Cortez said he wasn't going to talk without any kind of a deal.
It was clear that whatever Cortez was going to say, it was not going to be, quote unquote, on the record.
Investigators have DNA evidence and phone records that link convicted killer Cortez Butler to Francis Craig's murder. They arranged to talk to him while he's detained for an unrelated homicide. But he immediately tries to shut them down.
Cortez said he wasn't going to talk without any kind of a deal. I said, no one is giving you any kind of a deal without anyone knowing what you have to say.
Detectives press Butler hard until he finally agrees to talk. But only on one condition.
Cortez very pointedly and specifically asked repeatedly to not have the interview recorded.
If detectives agree not to record the interview, there's a chance Butler's testimony won't stand up in court. Still, with no other leads in the case, they decide to roll the dice.
We were there interviewing Cortez in the first place because we need to find out Eric Wolf's involvement in this. And it was dire that we did so as the children were about to go back with Eric Wolf. The whole idea for that was to keep these kids safe.
So the detectives tried to read him his rights. He didn't even want to be bothered with the rights. I know my rights. I think it was, bro, I know my rights, bro.
Butler wastes no time getting right to the point.
Cortez looked at me and said, "You have it all wrong." And I said, "Have what all wrong?" And he, at that time, let us know that Eric had absolutely nothing to do with this murder.
He goes, "I don't know this dude you're talking about, know nothing about him. Just trust me, he was not involved in this whatsoever."
The statement contradicts one of the investigators' strongest leads, but the next thing Butler says is even more explosive.
Cortez identifies himself as the killer. I remember thinking to myself, I'm glad we're sitting down right now, because I was almost in disbelief.
If Eric wasn't involved, why had this cold-blooded criminal murdered a woman to whom he had no obvious connection? It all went back to Rodney McKee's arson case.
Rodney McKee attempted to burn down a house with Ryan Marshall and his mother in it. Ryan Marshall was a key witness in his arson case.
He made some threats to Ryan that either he not agree to testify or he was going to be killed.
Cortez told us that he had been hired by Rodney McKee to kill Ryan Marshall.
First, Butler had to find Ryan, who was homeless because of the fire.
So we found out from Cortez Butler that they had bad information. They had information that Ryan Marshall was living with Francis Craig and Eric Wolf.
Cortez Butler entered Francis and Eric's house to kill someone who was no longer there.
Franny wasn't even the intended target. Franny was as innocent of a victim as anybody could ever be. When he opened the door, he had made the decision that he was killing somebody while he was there.
He doesn't have to force entry. He gets into the house. He noticed the bedrooms have some kids in it. He walks past them, and he goes to Franny Craig's room. When he gets to Franny Craig's room, he asks her where Ryan is. She said he's not there. Cortez tells Franny not to look at him. In his words, he stated she looked at him, so he had to kill her.
The horrific details that Cortez reveals next leave detectives with no doubt about the guilt of the man sitting across from them.
He decided to bind her, trying to get information from her, but she would not cooperate.
Cortez stabbed her multiple times.
We will never know how long he took to torture her and butcher her. And it clearly took time and effort to stab and slice her in the manner that he did. She died in the service of keeping Ryan's identity and his location secret, and/or she quite frankly just didn't know.
Cortez Butler's chilling confession is nothing short of a game changer, both for detectives and for Eric Wolf.
It eliminated our hypothesis that Eric Wolf was responsible for Franny's death.
Eric wasn't involved. He's an odd duck kind of guy.
Eric was able to regain custody of his daughter.
I took from this case that we can never jump to conclusions. I was pretty convinced that he did it, not to the point that I could charge him, but I was pretty convinced I had the right person.
Now that investigators do have the right person, they're determined to put Cortez Butler away for life. But all of that is in jeopardy.
I didn't believe that Cortez's confession would be legally admissible in court because it wasn't recorded. And if Cortez Butler ever walked free again, I don't know that any of us are safe.
After months of dead ends, investigators finally have a confession from Francis Craig's killer. But prosecutors are concerned that his testimony may not hold up in court.
I was concerned that it would be legally inadmissible because it wasn't recorded. He was basically told, we're not planning to use this in court against you. I was concerned that he had not been properly advised of his Miranda rights. But we still had his DNA on the zip ties and the cell phone records. So I kept thinking, and I finally got myself legally to a point where I was convinced that we need to give this a shot.
In October of 2015, Cortez Butler is charged with Francis's murder. When the trial begins 6 months later, Butler appears relaxed, almost giddy.
Cortez really seemed to thrive in that trial atmosphere. He would seek out cameras and smile at them, give them this big, full teeth smile.
He wanted to fight just because he could. He wanted to run the show just because he could.
But that's just a warm-up for the verbal assault he launches into when he takes the stand.
Cortez Butler was a monster at that trial. He bragged on how many bodies he had. It was unbearable.
Butler gleefully describes his murderous past in gory detail. But when asked about killing Francis, he fiercely denies it.
He clearly was so excited to say why he didn't commit this murder because he pleads to all of his murders, and he clearly didn't commit this one because he didn't plead to it.
Butler also denies ever confessing to police. But in a victory for prosecutors, the judge allows detectives to testify about Butler's confession.
We're able to get past that piece because he wasn't in custody for our case. He wasn't actually entitled to his Miranda warnings.
Eyewitness accounts play a major role in trying to move the jury, beginning with Eric's daughter, who found Franny dead.
Alexis was our first witness up there, and I don't know that I will ever forget the audible gasps and sobs and emotion pouring from the jury just from that first witness.
The physical evidence is laid out.
We have Cortez Butler's DNA on the zip ties that were used in the homicide, and we also have phone tracking information showing Cortez Butler and Jackson.
Prosecutors make a compelling case, but without a recording of Butler's confession. It's the detective's word against Butler's. When the jury returns with the verdict, there's no guarantee which way the cards will fall.
Cortez Butler was convicted of first-degree murder, and he won't ever walk free again.
The sentence was life without the possibility of parole for the premeditation murder of Franny Craig.
This was a complicated story to tell to a jury. It is a difficult one for all of us to wrap our brains around, even still.
Cortez goes to look for Ryan at her house, and he doesn't find him, and murders Franny in her own bed while she's doing nothing wrong.
Franny had no connection to her killer whatsoever. We can rest maybe a little easier that the bad guys won't ever hurt anybody else, at least not outside of the walls of prison. But none of it brings Franny back.
Today, Francis's 2 daughters live with their father. Those closest to Francis do everything they can to hold on to her memory.
Franny's family, I know, they've been lost ever since. I've been lost ever since Francis has been murdered.
I want people to remember how happy of a person she was, how generous, how nice and kind she was.
I miss Francis so much, and there's not a day that goes by that I do not think about her. I know that she's watching over everybody and making sure that everybody's good, because that's the type of person she was.
I wish I had known her, and I hope I honored her in my handling of this case.
For more information on an unexpected killer, go to Oxygen.com. An all-American woman.
She was a beautiful young gal, and she had a great personality.
She was amazing. She was so kind and so caring. She was my sister. She was my everything.
Is found murdered in her bedroom.
She had been strangled quite violently.
Whoever the killer was crushed the victim's neck.
Police hunt for the culprit.
I had in my mind who committed the crime.
We were convinced that he was our guy.
But the prime suspect slips from their grasp.
I don't get it. Did he really get away with it?
Decades later, leaps in forensic science reignite the investigation.
We're not giving up on the case. Is there a smoking gun? We gotta find it.
I figured that if this case could be solved, it could be solved now.
And new evidence leads to a killer no one saw coming.
It was shocking, it was unexpected, and guess what? We have a new suspect.
I was stunned. I was like, really?
In the early morning hours of June 6, 1980, the peaceful suburb of Woods Cross, Utah, is shaken by a frantic 911 call.
Emergency? Oh my God! What's the problem? My wife's been killed. I just got home from work. Okay, I'll see. What's your name? Steve Strong. Please hurry.
Woods Cross had never had a homicide. This was the first one, and it definitely was not something we were used to.
Police respond to the modest home on the outskirts of Salt Lake City.
Well, I got called to respond to this house that they'd said there had been a homicide. So I went into the bedroom area where the victim was, laying on the floor, kind of laying up against the bed. She appeared that she was in her sleeping clothes, just a little t-shirt and a pair of panties. First thing that I noticed, she had bruising and scratches on her neck area that looked like she had been strangled, and been strangled quite violently. In fact, I believe that she had put up quite a struggle and quite a fight. Torn fingernails and some bruising on her legs and her feet. It was an indication she fought pretty hard. It looked like she had been knocked off of the bed and onto the floor. 2 or 3 of the rungs in the bed that had been broken out. So it was obvious that there was a pretty good struggle had taken place there.
Police searched the rest of the house, looking for clues to what happened.
And looking around, I didn't believe that there could have been a robbery or anything of that nature, because everything else was in place.
It did not look like a robbery or theft. This looked more like a personal attack. This looked more like that she was the target of her killer.
Investigators turned to Steve Strom, the man who had called 911. He tells police the victim is his wife, 25-year-old Karen Strom.
Talking to Steve, he was kind of hysterical, just very upset that his wife was dead.
Steve worked at a manufacturing plant on the graveyard shift.
He said everything was fine when he left the house the night before to go to work. He worked the night shift till about 7 in the morning. And when he got home, he walked into the bedroom and saw his wife.
While investigators continue their hunt for clues, police inform Karen's family of the tragic news.
I was at work at the phone company. My stepmother called me and said, "Your sister's dead." I said, "What? What happened?" She goes, "We don't know yet." That was heart-wrenching. I wanted to know what happened to my sister.
Karen Saltzgiver was born in Bountiful, Utah in 1954, the oldest of 3 children.
Karen and I were 5 years apart. My parents divorced when we were younger, and that's always rough on kids. It was a struggle. But Karen was always there, playing mom, and I think it was just her nurturing instinct. She was amazing. She was strong.
In 1973, Karen married Steve Strom right out of high school at the age of 18.
Karen and Steve were high school sweethearts. Karen was very outgoing, very fun, very loving, and Steve was very quiet. She saw something in him. They used to go four-wheel driving a lot and up in the mountains a lot. It was a sense of freedom for her, and Karen loved nature.
Over the next 7 years, the young couple worked hard to build a life of their own.
Steve worked at a machine shop. Karen worked in accounting for the state of Utah. And they had an apartment in North Salt Lake, and then they bought a house in Woods Cross. It was a family-oriented place, and it was a new development. She was so excited because she got a house and a good job. You know, she had her Camaro and yellow. Yellow was her favorite color. It seemed like her life was on the right path.
Karen's seemingly perfect marriage had a troubling hidden side.
Steve liked to drink, and I think that's what caused a lot of the problems in their marriage. When Steve wasn't drinking, he was very quiet, but when he drank, yeah, there was a whole nother side of him that came out. He was mean. What I witnessed with Steve was a lot of screaming and yelling, and then he'd leave. Mostly what I witnessed with Steve and my sister was the aftermath. She had bruises, and Karen got good at hiding the bruises with makeup, but it's like, you could see them. You know, to me, I didn't understand. Karen defended Steve all the time. He's just going through a bad time. Things are rough. You know, he'll get over it. It's okay.
But 3 months prior to Karen's murder, something changed between her and Steve.
Karen finally had enough, told Steve she wanted a divorce, and I thought, yes, yes. I just wanted the best for her, because she wanted that for me.
But before Karen can move on, her life is brutally cut short.
My world had just fallen apart. My world was crushed. She was my everything. She was my sister, my protector. She was my best friend.
As Coco struggles to come to grips with Karen's death. Back at the crime scene, police continue their search for clues to who may have attacked Karen during the night.
There was no indication anybody had broke into the house. The next door neighbor said that she had heard nothing. Steve had calmed down by that time. He said that he had found the doors locked, and when he got home, used his key and went into the house.
As Steve is being questioned, Coco arrives looking for answers.
The police didn't give me any details on exactly what happened. They did say that she had been strangled. Then they brought her body out in a black bag, and oh, that just tore me up. It's like, that's my sister, don't put her in there. Steve was sitting there, and I just looked at him like he finally did it. There was no doubt in my mind that Steve did it.
When Coco got to the house there, the first thing she said, he did it, he finally did it, he killed her.
Anytime you have an incident like this, always start with the husband.
Coming up, detectives discover a tangle of relationships.
Steve said that everything was going great with him. It was pretty obvious that it was not.
Failing the polygraph was pretty damning.
Before their hunt for a killer produces a jaw-dropping twist.
An innocent person just wouldn't flee.
We were worried if we came to the door, he was going to shoot us.
And a new suspect with a dark past emerges.
He raped a girl, and then he stabbed her with a screwdriver and left her for dead.
Who is this guy, and how did he know my sister?
Police in Woods Cross, Utah are investigating the murder of 25-year-old Karen Strong. Her sister, Coco, has told police she suspects Karen's husband, Steve Strong, is the one that killed her.
Coco had been really close with Karen, and they talked a lot, and she had expressed that Steve was a heavy drinker, and when he got drunk or he'd been drinking, he got mean, he got abusive. Coco didn't like him at all.
Detectives learn how Karen had decided to end things with Steve 3 months ago.
She filed for divorce, and then she moved out to my stepmother's house.
Coco says that Karen was only at the house the night she was killed because she felt sorry for Steve.
It was his birthday and their anniversary. Steve had called her and said, "Can you come out and we'll just have dinner together?" And she did, because of her kind heart.
Coco believed that their relationship was over, although Karen agreed to come back and just kind of stay with him for a couple of days.
Recently separated from Steve, Karen had a new suitor named Buff.
Karen told me a little about Buff, that she met this guy that was really different, and he treated her really kind. And I don't know if she thought it would go anywhere, but I know it meant the world to her. He showed her that she could be treated decent and that she deserved it.
Coco said that Steve was also a very jealous person, and in her mind, was sure that he had killed her.
I said, how could it be anybody else? It was, it was Steve.
Detectives confront Steve Strom about Coco's allegations.
He consistently stated that he had a good relationship with his wife and that there was no abuse.
Steve felt that the only reason that they were getting a divorce, it was his drinking. He said that they had worked things out and that they were going to get back together, and she was not going to go through with the divorce.
Investigators ask Steve to account for his movements leading up to when he last saw Karen alive.
Steve said that he and Karen had gone out to dinner earlier that evening, and then they'd come home and watch TV, and then he got ready and left for work.
If Steve is telling the truth, Karen was killed sometime after midnight when Steve left for work, and before 7 a.m. when he returned home to find her body. Detectives ask, if the doors were locked during that time, how did Karen's killer get into the house?
Steve gave us the name of about 4 or 5 people that she might have opened the door for, but had indicated probably the one that she would really open the door for after she went to bed would have been Buff.
Steve admits that he knew Karen had been dating Buff while they were separated.
Steve said that the relationship with Karen and Buff was over, and that they were getting back together and make another go of their marriage.
With nothing concrete to hold him, detectives let Steve go. After police release Steve, the news that Karen was murdered spreads through Karen's family.
It just broke everybody's heart. My mom, that was her oldest daughter. She couldn't deal with it. She just shut down and shut off. It was just heart-wrenching, and it was something that was so surreal. I was trying to wrap my head around, she's really gone?
As Karen's loved ones reel from the murder, detectives head to the factory where her husband, Steve, works as a machinist to confirm his timeline and verify his story.
I talked to the supervisor and got copies of his time card, and as far as anybody there could remember, he was on his machine the entire time.
Despite confirming that Steve was at work when he said he was, investigators cannot dismiss their suspicion of him without a better idea of when Karen had been killed.
That timeline was very important to the case because we'd be able to tell who had opportunity during that time.
As detectives continue their investigation at Steve's workplace, one of Steve's co-workers they speak with is 29-year-old Ed Owens.
Steve Strom had named Ed Owens as one of the individuals that Karen would have allowed in. Ed and Steve were not only co-workers, but they had became friends. They socialized together, socialized with their spouses. Both of them liked to drink, and so they oftentimes did it together.
There was an incident where Steve would end up so intoxicated that Ed and Karen had to take Steve home and carry him into the house and put him to bed.
Ed tells detectives that he was working the shift before Steve arrived that night, but had left the plant for his meal break around 8 p.m.
Ed had said that he had left work and then gone to the local bar to get his lunch, and he started drinking with some friends till they closed the bar, and then went out in the parking lot and continued drinking.
Ed came back to the plant about 4:30 in the morning. He was obviously intoxicated. Steve had actually offered Ed a ride home, but Ed had refused and drove home intoxicated.
As investigators talk to Ed, something about his appearance draws their attention.
I did notice that he had some scratches on his arm and close to his eye on the nose.
Detectives question Ed about the scratches. Could he have been scratched while he attacked Karen?
He explained those as he worked on the lathe and there was the shavings. He was always kind of getting scratches or cuts on his thing. Talked to the supervisor at his work, and he indicated that happens quite frequently.
Just to be sure, detectives ask Ed's coworkers to confirm he was drinking with them the night of the murder.
I interviewed the people that he was hanging out with, and they all stated that he was there, and he didn't have any motive as far as I could determine.
With Ed's alibi confirmed, investigators turn their attention to the other man in Karen's love life, her boyfriend, Buff. Did he have motive for murder?
Steve Strom told the police they were reconciling. So then we have to begin to question Karen's termination of that relationship with Buff.
If they were going to get back together, Buff would have been upset about that. His attitude might have been, if he couldn't have her, nobody else would.
Less than a day after 25-year-old Karen Strom is found strangled to death, police in Woods Cross, Utah have ruled out her husband's friend, Ed Owens, as the killer.
There was no indication that Ed had been involved in the death of Karen.
But despite verifying his alibi, detectives do keep Karen's estranged husband, Steve Strom, on the suspect list.
Her sister Coco talked about how abusive he had been and that Karen needed to get out of that relationship.
Now, investigators want to speak with the man Karen started dating shortly after separating from Steve.
Buff Bangeter was a man who Karen Strom had had some degree of a relationship with, and so, of course, law enforcement had reason to talk to Buff.
Detectives begin the interview with the 35-year-old mechanic by informing him of Karen's murder.
He seemed upset when he found out that she had been killed.
Then, Buff stuns investigators by revealing just how serious his relationship with Karen had become.
According to Buff, they had wanted to get married, and it was Buff that persuaded her to go back to see Steve to be sure that what she wanted to do was get the divorce.
Detectives ask Buff where he was on the night Karen was killed.
Buff stated he was at home that whole evening and he would not have harmed her in any way. And he also made the comments that he thought it was Steve. According to Buff, it was pretty obvious that he was very angry about Buff's relationship with Karen.
Even with no one to back up his alibi, police decide to let Buff go.
We didn't eliminate him entirely, but after we interviewed and talked to Buff, we felt pretty confident that he was not the one who had committed that crime. I couldn't place anyone else having done the crime except for Steve. He remained my #1 suspect.
While they wait for crime lab analysis to be completed, detectives keep digging into the people Karen may have let into the house the night she was killed.
I interviewed each of the individuals who Steve indicated that he thought she might let in, took blood samples from each of them. I covered all the bases that I could.
Investigators also received the forensics report from the crime scene.
Crime lab went clear through the house and checking for fingerprints, and there was no fingerprints in the house that they could find other than Steve Strom and Karen. And that was pretty damaging as far as evidence towards Steve.
Karen's autopsy results also come back and show no evidence of sexual assault, but do confirm strangulation as the cause of death.
Whoever the killer was crushed the victim's neck. This was an aggressive, violent, vicious attack. Karen was scratching and clawing and fighting for her life.
Karen's fingernails are clipped and preserved.
As far as DNA back in 1980, there was not a lot more that they could do. The testing you could do with any sort of evidence was very limited.
The autopsy also provides an idea of when Karen was killed.
The approximate time of death was between 10 p.m. on the night of the 5th and 2 a.m. on the morning of the 6th.
This means it was possible Karen was killed before Steve left to go to work.
The time of death did not give Steve a strong alibi.
By his own statements, it was after midnight when he went to work, so he was at home during that period of time.
Armed with this new information, investigators reach out to get Steve in for another interview, and he makes a surprise request.
Steve requested to take a polygraph. He said that he was innocent, he didn't kill his wife. Polygraphs are not admissible into court, but it would also have been a good tool to see if he was lying or not. We did a polygraph and asked him if he knew who killed his wife, if he killed his wife, and if she was dead when he went to work. According to the polygraph operator, on those particular questions, he was extremely negative as far as being truthful.
Failing the polygraph was pretty damning to Steve, and we were more and more convinced that Steve was involved in this murder.
Detectives still need more evidence in order to charge Steve with Karen's murder.
I interviewed some of the people she worked with. They had indicated that numerous times saw her with bruises when she came to work. At one time, that she had bruises on her neck, and that she made a comment to them that Steve had choked her. She felt that she was lucky to be alive.
The co-worker's account is the final evidence police need to charge Steve, and a warrant is issued for his arrest.
We went to arrest him at work, but he was not there. One of the co-workers told us Steve was with a friend down in North Salt Lake in an apartment. They had indicated that he was worried that we were coming after him. He was possibly going to be violent and resist arrest. We were worried that if we came to the door, he was going to shoot us.
Police proceed to the apartment address with caution and establish a safety perimeter around the building.
We knew he had guns, that he might be violent. We were anticipating the possibility of it being a very difficult arrest.
Police investigating the murder of Karen Strom are preparing to arrest their main suspect, her estranged husband, Steve.
He had been known to have a weapon. It was a .357 Magnum. We was told that Steve had also made a comment to one of his co-workers that if the police come to get him, he was going to take a couple of pigs with him.
Having that information made us feel very nervous about approaching him.
Police maintain their distance, fearful of a violent confrontation.
There was a SWAT team that was organized that had surrounded the apartment. After several phone calls into the apartment, Steve wasn't cooperative.
Steve refuses to answer police phone calls. 3 hours tick by without a resolution before Steve finally answers.
Finally, he was convinced to come out peacefully.
2 months after his wife was killed, Steve is finally arrested for Karen's murder. The news quickly spreads to her loved ones.
The whole family, when they found out Steve was arrested, kind of breathed a sigh of relief. Good. You know, it was one step closer to being over.
After 2 months of investigation, prosecutors believe they have enough evidence to convict Steve of killing his 25-year-old wife.
There was significant pieces of evidence that pointed at Steve Strong circumstantially. It appeared that he had opportunity, didn't have a good alibi. He had motivation, potentially jealousy. He had history of domestic violence, particularly when Steve would drink. You had the incident where the co-worker saw Karen with strangulation marks on her neck, and Karen had told her it was Steve Strong that did it. So that was a significant component to the case. Put all the pieces of the puzzle together, and it did look like they've got a reasonable likelihood of conviction.
Steve is held on remand for 6 months as prosecutors prepare their case. But just before the trial is set to begin, Steve's defense attorney asked the judge to exclude the testimony from Karen's coworker about Steve strangling Karen.
The defense said the coworker didn't actually see it. The coworker is only reporting what Karen told her in what's known as double hearsay. And the judge made an evidentiary ruling that disallowed prosecutors from using that evidence or information at trial.
And that was kind of a shocker to me because that was one of our key pieces of evidence. Interviews where people had seen the bruises, she had told them who gave her the bruises. Unfortunately, all of that comes out to be hearsay evidence and was not going to be admissible to court.
Without an eyewitness to abuse, prosecutors have a hole in their case against Steve.
Without that information, they don't have enough evidence to persuade a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that he killed Karen. And if they go forward and lose, Steve Strong, because of double jeopardy, could never be prosecuted again for Karen's murder.
Prosecutors make the difficult decision to drop the charges and let Steve walk free.
When I found out the charges wouldn't hold, my heart just sank. It was like, what? Why is this happening? Show me why this is happening, because I can't wrap myself around this. I just didn't understand why they didn't have the evidence.
Coco was very upset that we had released him, and so was I, but most of the evidence that we had against him was circumstantial evidence. We didn't have any hard evidence towards Steve.
For the next 4 months, detectives continue digging, trying to find the evidence they need to close the case.
I did a lot of running around during that time, interviewing people and trying to find more evidence. However, most of the stuff we were getting was still hearsay.
By the time the 1-year anniversary of Karen's murder comes, little hope remains.
I felt that I had done everything that I could. My main thing at the time was making sure that I preserved all the evidence we had collected, so if something did come up later, we would be able to use it.
In the summer of 1981, the hunt for Karen's killer goes cold.
A year went by, another year went by, and I'd call anything, do you have anything new? Nothing, Coco, nothing, and it's like, did he really get away with it?
The case remains cold for more than 2 decades, but police in Woods Cross never forget the murder of Karen Strong.
I retired in 2005. However, I have to admit that I was still upset about the fact that I could not tie Steve to the murder.
In 2006, 26 years after the crime, new detectives take a fresh look.
This case was a high-profile case, and at one time there had been a lull in the caseload, so I had asked if I could focus all my time on this case. And knowing that there was new developments in science, I figured that it was the right time to pick this up, because if this case could be solved, it could be solved now. I went through the evidence looking for specific items that could be tested. The items that we sent into the lab for examination first were Karen's fingernails.
Police in 1980 found material under Karen's fingernails, but had no way of testing it. Could this hold the key to identifying Karen's killer?
We was quite worried that the evidence had degraded. I mean, it had been 26 years.
The crime lab tests Karen's fingernails, searching for her attacker's DNA.
When those results came back, it was a bombshell. There was DNA of Steve Strom underneath Karen's fingernails, but also there was unexpected DNA evidence underneath Karen Strom's fingernails. And guess what? We have a new suspect.
Investigators who have reopened the cold case murder of Karen Strom have just received their first clue in more than 25 years. DNA from under Karen's fingernails has been traced to 2 different men, her husband, Steve Strom, and someone on the original investigator's radar.
That DNA belonged to Ed Owens. The fact that Ed Owens's DNA was underneath Karen Strom's fingernails, it was shocking.
Ed Owens was Steve's friend and co-worker. Ed's blood had been collected in 1980, when police first considered him a suspect.
There was no recent contact between the two that anyone was aware of. We got to dig a little bit deeper into Ed Owens as a realistic suspect.
The presence of Ed and Steve's DNA is evidence to investigators the men had contact with Karen. But is it a sign that one or both had killed her? In search of answers, detectives tracked down the now 56-year-old Owens.
Ed and his wife were currently living in Falls Church, Virginia. Initially, when I was talking with Ed, he started asking me questions as far as who the suspect was and any new developments in the case. I was suspicious when talking to Ed because of the questions that he was asking me. I wanted him to come into Woods Cross and meet with me and discuss this matter face to face.
Ed Owens agrees to come back to speak with investigators the following week. Detectives also reach out to the now 53-year-old Steve Strom.
Steve had moved to Henderson, Nevada. I contacted Steve and asked him if he would come up from Henderson and meet with me and go over his statement that he gave back in 1980. He wasn't at all that cooperative. He said that for years he's been telling the authorities that he didn't do it, and he believed that we was still after him.
For prosecutors, Steve's DNA under Karen's fingernails does not, in fact, strengthen the case against him.
It was not new to learn he was with Karen on the night that she had been murdered. We're now looking at this from what can the science show us? Who can we show did what based upon this evidence? So now we need to take the next level of testing and figure out what type of DNA are we talking about.
Detectives resubmit the fingernail DNA for a more detailed analysis. And the forensics lab has another surprise in store for investigators.
It was determined that Steve's sample was very minute and Ed's was the dominant sample. And the substance of Ed's was seminal fluid. I was a little shocked about that.
Steve and Ed were close friends, but there was no relationship between him and Karen.
Karen's autopsy had shown no evidence of sexual assault, so investigators are surprised by the indication of sexual activity.
That was unexpected. Why is Ed Owens' seminal fluid underneath Karen Strom's fingernails? What happened here? Was this consensual sex that then went awry? Was it not consensual sex? Was this a forced sexual assault situation?
In the 1980 investigation, Ed's alibi put him at a bar with friends when Karen was killed.
I contacted the co-workers, people that had been to the bar with Ed on the night of the homicide. Both of the witnesses was unable to say whether Ed was at the bar the whole time.
The co-workers had also noticed the scratches on Ed's hands and face the day after Karen's murder.
Ed was asked how he obtained those injuries, and he said that he was playing with his dog.
Strikingly, that statement contradicts the one Ed gave to detectives 26 years prior.
Ed had said that those scratches were obtained by working on a lathe machine. This was raising some red flags as far as Ed's involvement in this matter.
Detectives are eager to talk to Ed themselves, but he fails to arrive for his scheduled interview.
Ed just mysteriously turned up missing 2 days after he had spoken with me. Left a note for his wife. It was a goodbye note. Well, after hearing this, I subpoenaed some banking records of Ed's And through those records, we determined that he crossed the border into Mexico. An innocent person just wouldn't up and leave his family and flee.
Detectives get another surprise when they dig deeper into Ed's background.
Back in 1980, the investigators ran a background check on Ed Owens in Utah. I, however, ran the national database on Ed Owens and found that Ed had been arrested in California in 1973 and charged with attempted murder.
A man raped a girl on the beach, strangled her, and then he stabbed her with a screwdriver and left her for dead. Ed Owens is charged and arrested, did go to trial, but Ed Owens' mother gave him an alibi. So the jury did not convict Ed Owens. Even though Ed hadn't been convicted, pieces of the puzzle just start to fall into place. We believe Ed's the killer.
An arrest warrant is issued for Ed Owens for the murder of Karen Strom.
When Sergeant Benson called me and said, "Coco, are you sitting down?" He goes, "Do you know who Ed Owens is?" I said, "I've never heard of him." And he said, "Coco, that's who killed your sister." I was shocked. All these years thinking of Steve, I was stunned. I was like, really? It was like starting all over again from scratch. Who's Ed Owens and how did he know my sister?
It was kind of a shocker to me because I was totally convinced that it was Steve.
With Ed Owens in Mexico, investigators strategize how to get him back to face justice.
I made contact with Ed's mother, advised her that I had a warrant of arrest for him and that he could either come in voluntarily to meet with me or his picture would be on the 5 o'clock news.
And then interestingly enough, Ed Owens then shows up. He came back to Utah, came walking in the door.
I was surprised that Ed actually showed up to the office. I believe that he was trying to put on this persona for his family of what type of a person he was. At that time, I took him to an interview room and attempted to get a statement from Ed. However, he lawyered up and didn't want to make a statement.
On March 14, 2007, after 2.5 decades, Ed Owens is arrested and charged with the murder of Karen Strom.
Our case is looking pretty good to us at this point in time. We've got science now backing us up. We've decimated his alibi. We've got the evidence of flight. So a lot of things were stacking up in favor of a conviction.
But then, 3 weeks before the trial, prosecutors are thrown another curveball when they learn of Ed's defense.
The defense's contention was going to be that Karen was having an affair with Ed. Steve became jealous and enraged about it. Steve went home and killed her.
The defense attorney was claiming that seminal fluid of Ed's only shows that he had had an affair with Karen, not that he'd actually killed her.
It's a jolt. We were kind of blown away. Ed had never, ever come forward with that story before. This was something new, so it opened up a new can of worms.
Prosecutors know this defense could be enough to raise reasonable doubt to a jury, especially since Steve had originally been charged with Karen's murder. But how could they disprove the defense's claims?
Is there a smoking gun with this case? We got to find it. We now need to regroup. So again, like they did back in 1980, we dismissed the case without prejudice as we're getting close to trial. That was not an easy decision to make, but we knew it was the right thing to do. We were confident we had the right guy, but at that point in time, we weren't confident we had a case where we were going to be able to secure a conviction. So Ed Owens walked away a free man. That was a tough pill to swallow because we knew he wasn't innocent. Can we prove it?
When the case got dismissed, it was very frustrating. When Ed walked out, I was ticked off to say the least. However, this wasn't the end for us. We were even more determined that we were going to bring him to justice.
26 years after the murder of Karen Strom, police have arrested their second suspect in the crime, Ed Owens. But prosecutors are forced to drop charges against Ed, leaving Karen's family desperate for justice.
After they released Ed Owens, I told Troy, Please don't give up, you guys. Come on, there's got to be something. Please don't give up.
I made a promise to Coco Saltzgiver. We're not giving up on the case. We're not abandoning it. Dismissal without prejudice means it can be refiled. We knew Ed Owens did it. We just wanted to get to the point where we knew we could actually prove it.
Detectives re-interview those who knew Karen to find out if she really could have been having an affair with Ed Owens before she was killed.
And all the witnesses that I talked to, it was pretty obvious that Steve, being as jealous as he was, and also Karen's relationship with Buff, Karen would not be having an affair with Ed Owens.
With no evidence of sexual assault found during Karen's autopsy, prosecutors need to establish an alternate theory to Ed's claim of an affair.
So why is Ed Owens' seminal fluid underneath Karen Strom's fingernails? The best theory that we had is Ed Owens went into Karen Strom and Steve Strom's home that night in the summer of 1980 with intent to sexually assault her. That Karen successfully stopped him. I believe that that's probably the best answer because there was no genital injury to our victim, Karen Strom. Yet there's a hell of a struggle. And the way he crushed her neck, it's in anger. He didn't get what he wanted.
Prosecutors know they only have one shot at making Ed pay for his crime, and they'll need hard evidence to convince a jury.
We can't let him get away with it now again for what he did in 1980. We had to continue to focus in on that crime scene, focus in on Karen's body, go through all the evidence again, looking at every crime scene photo that we had, blowing things up. It's there. We're not going to give up until we find it.
Investigators spend weeks examining the evidence in minute detail. Then, they catch something on the underwear Karen was wearing the night she was killed.
One of the things that we did notice was there were some very tiny droplets that had never been analyzed. They'd kind of been overlooked.
We submitted those to the crime lab. We did not know exactly what it was.
When those results came back, another one of these aha moments, that material that was on Karen Strom's panties was Ed Owens' blood. And now we've got this. This was not a consensual sexual encounter.
It's the final piece prosecutors are looking for. Ed Owens is picked up and recharged with Karen's murder.
When Ed Owens was rearrested, it was a great feeling. Now we felt like our case was ready for prime time.
At trial, in front of Karen's family, prosecutors present how the crime unfolded.
Ed had gone to the bar, and knowing that Steve was coming into work, slipped out of the bar, and then went to the Strom residence to sexually assault Karen. Struggle ensued. She started lashing out at him. He ended up grabbing her by the throat, killed her, then went back to the bar with his co-workers, using them as an alibi.
Sitting through that trial and watching the evidence they had, it was horrific what he did to her. Oh my God, she must have been terrified. But she fought. Oh, she fought hard.
Who is the best witness against Ed Owens? It's Karen Strom. By the fight she put up and the evidence she gathered, part of what she got out of him when she gouged him was his blood.
The defense argues that Ed is innocent and that Steve killed Karen out of jealousy.
Ed seemed like he was very cocky and that he was confident that he was going to beat this case.
The judge let me address him at the trial. I said, "You took my sister from me. You took my best friend. You took the person I feel safe with in the world. You took that from me." And he's smiling at me. He was smiling the whole time.
After a 7-day trial, the jury takes just 9 hours to come to a decision. On April 1st, 2009, the jury returns their verdict.
When they said guilty, I just, yes! You know, and then I said, "Karen, we did it! Sissy, we did it! We got him!"
There were a lot of people that waited many, many years for justice with this case. When the jury said guilty, it's a sense of relief, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of justice for the victim.
Almost 30 years after Karen Strom was killed, Ed Owens is sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole.
His first parole hearing will be in 2032. Ed at that time will be in his upper 80s. Ed will essentially be spending the rest of his life in jail.
For Karen's loved ones, Ed may have taken her life, but he can never take Karen from their hearts.
I think of Karen all the time. I have a picture of her on my bookshelf, and I know her energy is still there. I can feel it. She was just so kind and so caring. She was a beautiful person, a beautiful soul. You can never be the same again when somebody's ripped out of your life like that. And you have that hole, but you can heal from something like this. It is possible. But you fill that hole with life. And you hope you live a good life for her too, because she didn't get to.
A devoted couple building the perfect family.
They were both very committed to adopting children that had a difficult past.
Everybody in the family loved her.
Murdered in a night of unspeakable horror.
She saw a man with what appeared to be an axe.
Her skull was split with a maul.
Who could have wanted Bob and Kay Swartz dead?
This person had threatened to kill them.
We couldn't rule out anyone. We just didn't know.
And what detectives uncovered has everyone blindsided.
I didn't have a single suspicion. I would have never thought.
The relatives were in disbelief.
The expected killer hadn't done it. The unexpected killer had done it.
Nobody in a million years would have expected them to commit one of the most heinous crimes in the history of Annapolis.
On a cold winter morning in 1984,
Armando County Police.
Police in Cape St. Clair, Maryland, receive an eerie call.
Okay, what is the problem, sir? My parents are dead. You think your parents are dead? Yeah.
First responders race to the scene and make a horrific discovery.
When I arrived, there were uniformed officers that were protecting the crime scene who told me we had a 17-year-old and a 9-year-old who just learned that their parents, Bob and Kay Swartz, were killed.
The children are visibly shaken and in shock, but agree to answer a few questions.
My partner and I met with a young man by the name of Larry Schwartz and his sister Annie. Both of them were very calm. This young man, he said that he had gotten up that morning and that Annie, who was 9, told them that she didn't know where their parents were. He then looked out the dining room window and saw his mother's body in the backyard. He told me he immediately shielded Annie's eyes so Annie wouldn't see her body and called the police.
Detective Barr leaves the kids in the care of the attending officers and moves to the backyard. It's his first grim look at the scene of the crime.
Kay Swartz was found outside. She was a few feet from the sliding glass door in the snow. She only had one sock on her right foot. Her left foot was bare.
The blood in the snow was horrific. It was just horrific.
The blood had created a slush in the snow. Kay Swartz had puncture wounds around her neck, and she had a massive wound to the top of her skull.
Detective Barr then heads inside.
I looked in the basement area, and I found a black vinyl chair that had pooled blood beside it. It appeared as though she had been attacked sitting in that chair, and she bled heavily onto the floor. And there was blood from that chair leading out back.
Just when it seems the crime scene can't get any more grisly, detectives discover another ravaged body.
We found a small office adjacent to the landing of the stairs. The door was closed. We opened the door, looked inside, and found Bob Schwartz's body. There was an inordinate number of stab wounds to Bob Schwartz. There were defensive wounds in the body. We theorized at that point it was very possible that Kay was attacked first, and then Bob heard the noise and started to come out of the room, giving Kay the opportunity to flee out the back door as the killer or killers went after Bob.
As detectives make their way through the rest of the house, they see no signs of forced entry. Did Bob and Kay know their attacker? Or did an intruder sneak in through an unlocked door?
As I viewed this crime scene, the enormity was off the chart. There was blood found everywhere. It was extraordinarily gruesome.
Investigators collect blood evidence, but there's no sign of a knife or any kind of murder weapon. Then, toward the back of the house, they spot a critical clue.
We found a bloody palm print on the sliding glass door near Kay's body. We wanted to figure out who it actually belonged to. Bob obviously never left the computer room. He died where he was attacked. And Kay's body was outside, and neither one of her hands had blood on the palms. That palm print probably belonged to the killer.
While concerned neighbors whisk Larry and Annie away, detectives get a chance to talk to some of Bob and Kay's grieving friends who have gathered at the house.
When I found out that Bob and Kay had been murdered, I said, "What? You're numb. You don't know what happened." And I just couldn't believe that Bob and Kay were gone.
Bob and Kay Swartz met at the University of Maryland outside Washington, D.C. They were both getting their master's degree in education. They both wanted to be teachers. He was 35, she was 27. She fell in love with him, and maybe 18 months later, they married.
They were very involved in all kinds of church activities. Kay and Bob were intimately involved. Everybody seemed to know them. Everybody felt a connection with them.
Bob was an engineer of sorts, worked at NASA Goddard down in Greenbelt, Maryland, in the space program on some level.
Bob had to be a pretty clever man because he was involved in computers back in the dark ages, 1984.
He was always very positive. He was funny, quick sense of humor.
Kay was the fun-loving, carefree spirit, beloved by everyone who knew her. Always wanted to be a teacher, became a teacher. They wanted children, but Kay was unable to have children.
Far from breaking their spirit, Bob and Kay's disappointment only seemed to strengthen their bond and gave them a loving sense of purpose.
They decided they wanted to open their house and their hearts.
In 1973, Bob and Kay embarked on their dream.
That became part of their mission in life, in adopting children that had a difficult past, to provide some substance and some guidance.
Larry Swartz was 6 years old when the Swartzes adopted him. 6 years later, they adopted a 4-year-old girl, Anne.
Annie was born in Korea, did not speak much English when she first arrived. Annie and Larry were happy to be part of that family.
Kay and Bob wanted to be the best parents ever to those children.
Now, Larry and Annie were orphans again, and detectives need to find out who committed such a heinous crime and why. Police begin by talking to neighbors, hoping to find a witness who might lead them to the killer.
We were alerted by a person approximately a block away on a parallel street that he had found what appeared to be a blood trail leading into the woods at the end of that street. And as we followed that trail, we found what appeared to be a barefoot footprint and a socked footprint.
Were these Kay's footprints? If so, how did they end up in the woods when her body was found in the backyard?
We also found a pair of footprints made by shoes. Footprints suggesting a chase through the neighborhood.
The trail of footprints ran for quite a distance through the woods and the neighborhood.
The footprints seemed to suggest that after stabbing Bob to death, the murderer went after Kay one last time.
In my opinion, it appeared as though Kay Swartz was fleeing from her killer, and at some point, a person caught up with her and then walked her to the back of the home where she was killed.
At the end of the trail, detectives make one more pivotal discovery.
Searching through the woods, my sergeant found what appeared to be a murder weapon. It was a wood-splitting maul. There appeared to be blood on the maul, along with hair. But the handle appeared to have been wiped clean. There wasn't any blood on the handle at all.
Detectives send the maul to the lab, but find no trace of a knife anywhere. It's a puzzling scene that offers them few clues.
It was a very difficult crime scene to try to put together in your mind what may have happened or how did this occur. At this point, we only had 2 children, Larry and Annie, who could provide any information.
When detectives circle back to them at the neighbor's house, they do their best to help.
Annie related to us that she had awakened in the middle of the night to her father's screams of "help me, help me." She continued to tell us that she went to investigate and she walked to the door that exited to the carport. At that point, she saw a man walking away with what appeared to be an axe over his shoulder. And she described the person as very tall, with curly hair, and asked, "Was that person as tall as me?" She said, "No, he was taller."
Detectives speak to Larry next, but suddenly the 17-year-old seems nervous. Does he know something about the man Annie saw in the yard?
When we pressed Larry, he said that Michael was 6'4".
Detectives stop cold. Who is Michael?
And very quickly I established that Michael Schwartz was a brother of Larry.
As it turned out, Bob and Kay Schwartz had adopted 3 children.
Michael, who was also 17, no longer lived with them, but it wasn't clear why. So at that point, we were very, very eager to talk to Michael.
Coming up, investigators uncover bad blood and dark secrets.
They send him to a state mental hospital.
Detectives uncover startling clues.
Nobody expected anything like this to happen.
It became almost unbelievable.
Was there more than one person with a score to settle?
This person said, "I could stick a knife in his back."
We didn't know what we were dealing with.
When they appear to have no suspects in the homicides of Bob and Kay Schwartz, police learn the couple's adopted children have an estranged brother.
Both Annie and Larry related to us that Michael no longer lived with them, but had been getting into a lot of trouble.
Detectives are anxious to know more. Could Michael have possibly wanted to harm Bob and Kay?
As we spoke to relatives during the investigation, Michael was quickly identified by them as someone we should look at very closely.
Michael had made threats internally in the house.
Detectives interview the Schwartz's friends and family to get more insight into Michael's history. Larry was the Schwartz's first adopted child. But long before Annie, Bob and Kay provided Larry with a brother.
Michael was 8 years old when the Schwartzes adopted him. The boys were only 6 months apart in age.
The Schwartz's second adopted child had arrived at their home, a troubled boy.
As they interviewed everybody, detectives found that Michael's mother abandoned him when he was an infant, and Michael was relinquished to the custody of the state and became a foster child. He went through a series of 6 foster homes before the Schwartzes adopted him.
Bob and Kay were determined to turn Michael's life around, but the boy's difficult past wasn't easy to shake, and the problems started almost immediately.
Michael was so antisocial in his approach to life. Michael was having behavioral issues at home, not obeying his parents on a consistent basis, smarting back, profanity.
As the boys grew older, Michael continued to struggle. But that didn't stop Bob and Kay from having high hopes for both their children.
I think Bob and Kay expected Larry and Michael to apply themselves very diligently to their studies and to do well. I think that Larry had a desire to please people. He had kind of a soft-spoken shyness to him. He seemed to want to engage with people. But I think Michael was a challenge from the get-go. I think Michael, he had some deviancies that probably would have precluded anybody from having any type of relationship with him on any level.
2 years after Michael was adopted, Bob and Kay found a new ray of hope when they adopted Annie.
Annie was cute as a button when she arrived. Everybody loved her.
Bob adored Anne. Annie became the apple of her father's eye, and suddenly Annie, the baby, became the favorite child. Everybody in the family loved her.
The more attention Bob gave Annie, the harder he was on his 2 boys. Larry seemed to be able to turn the other cheek, but not Michael.
Michael had been getting into trouble more increasingly over the last year or so.
Michael began to have problems of a fairly serious nature. Tension between he and his father, tension between he and the other family members.
By 1980, Michael's rebellious nature pushed his parents to their breaking point.
One night, Michael asked to go out, and they said no. So he sneaked out. Went out with his buddies. When he came back home at about midnight, he pounds on the door. His mother comes to the door, looks at him and says, "No, we're not letting you in." He goes over to a neighbor's house, spends the night, goes to school the next day on his own. And while he's there, his parents had called. Social services said, "We can't handle him anymore."
After 5 years of struggling with Michael, Bob and Kay were so concerned about his volatile behavior that they asked the state to place him with another family.
He never lived at home again.
It was just a very difficult situation. Bob and Kay loved him, but they felt there was nothing they could do for him.
While Bob and Kay tried to stay focused on Larry and Annie, Michael's state of mind seemed to deteriorate.
Michael had been in a reform school, and he got in a fight and got in some trouble, so they sent him to a state mental hospital for evaluation. And that was just a few weeks before the murders. He was staying at this facility.
The Crownsville State Hospital Center was terrifying, faceless, institutional, decrepit buildings, straight out of a Stephen King nightmare.
Had Bob and Kay's rejection led Michael Swartz to commit a cold-blooded murder? Detective Barr and his partner decide to make the short drive to Crownsville and ask Michael for themselves.
He was interrogated by these talented homicide detectives. Michael's denying.
Michael's words say one thing, but to the detectives, his appearance tells a different story.
They did notice it. Michael had very noticeable marks on his long neck, and he clearly had an injury of some kind there. But he said they were hickeys.
Detectives keep pushing, but Michael is adamant that he was at the hospital on the night of the murders, and the hospital records back up his claims.
We learned from the staff that their logs indicated that Michael had been there all evening.
He has what appears to be an ironclad alibi. I mean, he is in a locked ward in a state mental hospital.
The police weren't so sure. A lot of people weren't so sure. It was very lax at this Crownsville State facility. It's not a prison. It's just a hospital.
Detectives aren't completely convinced of Michael's alibi, but they don't have enough to arrest him either. And soon after that interview, Michael Swartz lawyers up.
Of course, I finally got to him. I did what all defense lawyers do, which is to say, don't say a word to anybody about anything. He was never interrogated again.
Michael won't talk, and the lab has found no useful prints on the handle of the splitting maul. But detectives know one key piece of evidence from the crime scene that could tell them everything they need to know.
During the investigation, there was a bloody palm print recovered from the sliding glass door. We had examined both victims. Neither one had blood on the palms.
If detectives can prove Michael Swartz left that print, they'll have their murderer. But that's easier said than done.
This evidence was difficult to analyze. We were very limited in 1984 with what we could do. This would involve the evidence being sent to the FBI laboratory in Washington.
Detectives investigating the savage double murder of Bob and Kay Swartz are hoping one of their most promising pieces of evidence will help them catch the killer.
A bloody palm print was lifted and sent to the FBI laboratory for analysis. We knew that it would probably take a long time to get those results.
While the feds in Washington do their careful work, the shocking news of the murder spreads.
There was a tremendous uproar in the community about this murder. A couple were murdered in their own home. A crazed killer chasing a woman through the neighborhood. There was a lot of pressure to solve the case.
That pressure only mounts when detectives receive the coroner's report. It's a grim account of a seemingly psychotic attack.
The wounds to Mr. Swartz numbered 17 in total, and in fact were lethal. Both his right and left carotid were severed during the attack.
On Kay Swartz, the autopsy showed that she was stabbed 7 times around her neck area, but they were very light wounds, tentative, and then her skull was split with a maul.
Detectives still haven't been able to locate the knife used in the attack, but the coroner's report does appear to confirm that they're on the right track.
According to the medical examiner, we had the right theory about how this may have occurred. Kay was stabbed in the basement, got up to flee. The killer would have chased Kay Swartz as she ran from the neighborhood and into the woods, then back to the house where she was killed.
Is it possible Michael Swartz eluded security at the Crownsville Mental Hospital and committed this crime? If so, detectives need to understand why.
I think it's fair to say there was tension in the house. Bob had a bit of a shorter fuse than Kay and had a little bit less willingness to be tolerant of some of the children's shortcomings.
Neighbors tell detectives a story they remember from a few years before, when Michael was still living with the Swartzes.
Michael got in trouble for some sin, fighting on a school bus, something like that. And his father decided physical labor was what he needed. So he gave him this heavy wood-splitting maul and said, take this stump out of the front yard, a dead tree stump. It was massive, a massive thing. There was no way Michael could get it. But he just swung it again and again and again.
Neighbors told us that Michael chopped at that tree every evening for up to 3 hours. And approaching a month later, the stump was still there. This boy had blisters on his hands.
Michael was seething and getting more and more angry. Everybody said Michael had threatened to kill his parents.
Could the maul that was used to teach Michael Swartz a lesson have been the same one that ended Kay's life?
Michael told his mother, Kay, that I could walk up to Bob and stick a knife in his back, kill him, and no results would befall me because I'm a juvenile. The logical assumption on all of our parts was Michael had made good on his threat. He had said he would do it, and now he's done it.
Four days after they were found brutally murdered, Bob and Kay are laid to rest.
The funeral, I had replays of having moments with them. I always admired them. Like, why would somebody kill them?
The couple's obedient children, Larry and Annie Swartz, have been staying with friends of the family. while their brother still resides at Crownsville.
Michael Swartz was allowed out of the hospital to come to the funeral, and at the cemetery, both boys stood over the grave and shook holy water, one into Kay's grave, the other into Bob's grave. Off to one side, the two detectives on the case stood in their suits with their sunglasses in the cemetery.
Everyone gathered around, gave them their support. But most people believed it was Michael who had done it.
Many note the suspicious red marks still visible on Michael's neck. Talk spreads through the community.
The newspapers were saying that Michael was a suspect. But even though he was in Crownsville at the time, there was some question about the accountability there, and maybe he could have gotten away and done it.
With lingering concerns over Michael's alibi and the security at Crownsville, detectives decide there's only one way to find the truth once and for all.
Wanting to make sure that we had crossed every T and dotted every I, my partner and I decided that we were going to follow up and visit that mental hospital again. We wanted to make sure that it was impossible that Michael would never have been able to leave undetected. So we asked the staff to lock us in the ward where Michael was committed. If Michael could have gotten out of that, there was a chance Michael had done it.
Detectives are about to put Michael Swartz's alibi to the test by locking themselves in the room where he stayed at the Crownsville Mental Hospital.
If he had killed his parents, Michael would have had to leave undetected, return, and get back in without someone discovering that. And we went through every door and every window, and there was no possible way we could have gotten out of that without help. So it was very convincing to us that Michael was not at the scene of the murder. Michael's been eliminated as a suspect.
It's good news for Michael, but a setback for detectives. The young man was their strongest lead. Undaunted, investigators reach out to the public, hoping to cast a much wider net.
As we conducted our investigation, we methodically went through a list of possible persons that may have intended harm to the Swartzes. We started a hotline for people to call in tips, and we got phone calls from various neighbors and acquaintances.
One of the many calls that come in immediately piques the detectives' interest.
Persons we interviewed told us that Bob steadfastly picketed an abortion clinic in Annapolis for 4 years, never missed a Saturday. And he would approach women entering the abortion clinic and attempt to change their mind about what they were going to do.
He would intensely try to dissuade women from coming into the clinic. He would get up in their faces.
Detectives confirm that a few of those women filed police reports against Bob, so they begin interviewing every complainant and witness connected with those reports.
The police were called on several occasions by the clinic. Bob was never arrested, but he caused the abortion clinic a lot of grief.
Could the killer be someone Bob confronted, or someone with a grudge against Kay?
Kay was a school teacher at Broadneck High School.
In her classroom, she was known for laissez-faire, not a strict disciplinarian.
According to witnesses, Kay was well liked in school. She was an easygoing teacher.
Detectives pursue every credible tip that comes in.
Our investigation revealed that there was no evidence that anyone would have a vendetta against her. In fact, there was no motive that we could establish where anyone would have been that angry or vengeful to want to kill either of them.
8 days after the brutal double murder, investigators have hit a wall. With no fingerprints on the splitting mall and their single most promising piece of evidence still under analysis, detectives are all out of options. Undaunted, they decide to start fresh, poring over every piece of evidence they do have, starting at the very beginning.
Out of Arundel County Police. Okay, what is the problem, sir?
My parents are dead.
You think your parents are dead?
Yes.
This time, investigators hone in on something they didn't notice before.
When I listened to the 911 call, Larry Schwartz said, "My parents are dead."
My parents are dead.
However, he told the first police officer on the scene that he hadn't gone downstairs. His father was in the basement. At that point, he was only known that his mother was dead, not his father. So there's an inconsistency there. It didn't make sense.
The discovery leads Detective Barr to take a harder look at Larry's version of events, and he finds several contradictions.
For example, Larry telling us that he saw his mother's body from the window. Yet I looked out the dining room window and couldn't see her body. I thought perhaps he was confused and meant to say the kitchen window, which turned out to be even worse. I climbed on the kitchen counter and looked out the window and still couldn't see her body.
Detective Barr had chalked it up to the extreme shock the boy had suffered that morning.
Larry's demeanor wasn't unusual at the time. Various people react differently under stress. He could have very well been in shock, repressing his feelings. I didn't know.
Barr wants to give Larry a chance to clear up his story, but that isn't going to happen.
Larry had gotten an attorney. The attorney had advised him not to talk to us.
At last, word comes in from the FBI. Test results on their key piece of evidence from the crime scene. The bloody palm print on the sliding glass door. The one detectives believed was made by the killer.
It came back. Finally, we could find out who it could possibly belong to, what we were dealing with.
Coming up, it's a twist that no one saw coming.
A chill just went up my spine. It just didn't seem right.
Detectives working to catch Bob and Kay Schwartz's killer finally had the results of their key piece of crime scene evidence from the FBI's forensic lab in Washington, D.C.
I was notified by the FBI laboratory that they had positively identified the bloody palm print recovered from the sliding glass door.
The results confirm what detectives believed months earlier. The palm print belongs to one of Bob and Kay's own children, but not the child they suspected.
It came back belonging to Larry Schwartz. At that point, the state's attorney for Anne Arundel County authorized an arrest warrant be obtained for Larry Schwartz.
Authorities charged young Schwartz as an adult with 2 counts of first-degree murder.
When the news gets out, it causes an uproar in Cape St. Clair. Michael Schwartz was known as the bad kid in the family, not handsome, likable Larry.
A chill just went up my spine. It just didn't seem right. I didn't have a single suspicion.
It was very difficult to accept that Larry had that type of violence within him.
Larry was seen as this model, mild-mannered son. Nobody in a million years would have expected him to commit one of the most heinous crimes in the history of Annapolis.
The community was in denial. The majority of them were convinced that Michael Schwartz had done this. There was certainly a lot of speculation about whether we had the right person or not.
It was very hard for people to believe that he could have done it. I think that they just felt there was more to this. There was more going on than any of us could understand.
Why would a docile youth, beloved by everybody, explode in a rage and stab both his parents? Why? Everybody wanted to know the answer.
Authorities want answers too. But Larry, at the direction of the defense team hired by concerned family friends, is not talking and has neither admitted nor denied guilt. So for the next 15 months, while Larry waits it out in jail, detectives spend every waking moment trying to build an airtight case.
We lacked a confession. The state's attorney for Analog County had me reassigned to his office to work exclusively on this case. We had to make sure that we had every piece of evidence we could get to close this case.
Without Larry's confession, detectives need to find out what led this soft-spoken boy to such violent extremes.
I continued to interview people, collect statements.
Investigators soon realized that Michael wasn't the only son who had a hard time at home.
I believe that Larry was under tremendous pressure. He was repeatedly chastised for the poor grades. He was restricted from leaving the yard.
I think it was more of a protection thing. You're trying to keep him away from the wrong crowd, and I think Larry could have been pulled in many ways. I think they were afraid of that.
I believe personally that he was angry. He was frustrated. It was cumulative, that he was holding rage inside him, and whatever may have happened that night set him off.
But some speculated that there was another reason why Larry turned on his parents.
Michael kept contact with Larry. He changed Larry's view of the family, and in a negative way. He was telling him that they just got rid of me, they want nothing to do with me, you know. Larry, he didn't want to be left like that. He didn't want to go into foster home again.
Larry was extremely worried that what happened to Michael would happen to him.
Then it changed, where he was afraid he was going to be put out.
Despite what may have led to this violent act, 17-year-old Larry Swartz is about to be tried for first-degree murder.
15 months after the crimes, the prosecutor had witnesses ready to line up, psychiatric witnesses who said Larry was sane, and he knew what he was doing, and he actually planned it. And they had a case to present that showed premeditated, cold-blooded murder.
Larry Swartz looked unconcerned as he arrived this morning from the county jail where he had spent the last 15 months.
More than 60 witnesses have been subpoenaed to testify at Larry Swartz's trial, which is expected to last 2 weeks.
I was at the courthouse expecting a trial. There was no trial. Nobody expected anything like this to happen. It was shocking.
After detectives and prosecutors have labored more than a year preparing their case against Larry Swartz for the murder of his parents, a last-minute maneuver by Swartz's legal team has brought everything to an unexpected, screeching halt. The trial is called off.
Larry had confessed to his attorneys.
He broke down. He broke down sobbing and heaving, and he said he did it, he was guilty, and he just killed them.
Finally, authorities have their confession, leaving behind any doubt of Larry's guilt.
Ultimately, the expected killer hadn't done it. The unexpected killer had done it.
Now, the state's attorney's office has to decide what punishment could possibly fit this crime.
The state agreed to a plea of second-degree murder.
The prosecutor recommended a 20-year sentence with all but 12 suspended. The judge agreed to make it concurrent as opposed to consecutive. I've never seen a case that lenient.
The state's attorney wanted me to take Larry to the confinement facility. He knew that if I took Larry, there was a potential for Larry to tell me why he did this and how did it really occur. And I sat down with him and asked him to tell us, Larry, why did you do it? He didn't answer me. And I pressed him again, and he said, I just lost it. He said that he had come home from school that day, and later in the evening, his mother had asked him how he had done on his tests. And he knew that he had failed Spanish, and she had been writing him about not doing well in school. And she made a caustic remark about his grades, you probably failed them, meaning the tests. So he took a knife and he stabbed her repeatedly about the neck. And then Bob was alerted to the activity, the noise, and he attacked Bob. Larry never did explain or admit to chasing Kay through the neighborhood. I found out during the autopsy that she had been stabbed through her esophagus, so perhaps she couldn't scream. With sheer terror, running for her life, Larry did admit to putting the splitting maul into his mother's head.
After committing such a violent act, Larry knew there was only one way to cast off suspicion.
Anne Arundel County Police.
We came to the realization that throughout the interview with Larry, he was trying to steer our investigation. He force-fed us information about Michael.
The whole time that his brother Michael was a suspect in the killings, Larry played the victim card.
When we were here for the funeral, Larry wanted to hang out with us, essentially, which we were perfectly prepared to do, not believing for a minute that he was involved. We viewed him as a victim, a kid who didn't have any parents at this point in time. It's, to this day, hard to fathom.
Though Larry's adoptive brother Michael had been exonerated, he nonetheless met with a tragic end.
When it turned out that he didn't commit the murders, he had nowhere to go. His parents are dead. His brother's in prison. His sister's been adopted by another family, and he has no one in the world. He starts doing drugs, and while he's taking drugs, he and his buddies go rob a man, and in the course of robbing the man, they stabbed him to death. Michael is sentenced to prison for life. None of the leniency his brother got. Life. He's now in his 50s, still in prison in the state of Maryland, 35 years later.
This just had to be one of the worst lose-lose destructive situations that society can see happen.
Looking back over this case, I have empathy for both Michael and Larry. I know that they struggled, yet the parents still tried to do the right thing.
Kay and Bob had adopted children who had been through a lot of bad times. And so I think they were trying to heal the wounds that they came to the family with.
For both Michael and Larry, I could understand the frustration, the anger, but I couldn't understand the murder. That's the part I didn't understand.
For more information on an unexpected killer, go to Oxygen.com.